The heroine picked up a pen, preparing to write a farewell letter to her beloved mother. Everything she said had come true. The girl's love was neither eternal nor unique. As she was about to put the letter into an envelope, a tall man in uniform entered, urging the saint to leave quickly. After handing him the letter to send, she learned that the prince was already waiting for her outside. As she and the male protagonist walked along the palace colonnade, contemplating her life, she suddenly heard the angry shouts of the crowd. The people standing near the palace demanded that the saint be brought out. They demanded her immediate execution. Not long ago, a demon had appeared in this world, after which half of Western Otana was reduced to ashes. In their panic and despair, rumors began to spread that sacrificing the saint would solve everything. Otana's only saint was the prince's beloved, the protagonist, Laviore Rea Bailey. However, no such saint existed in this country. The girl was actually an imposter. More precisely, Lara was merely an illusion created by the prince of this country to seize the throne. Lara was just a supporting character in a script concocted by the prince and the temple. And the protagonist of this drama was none other than His Highness, Sidal Hoftenoting. He was the man Lara loved with all her heart, but in the end, he turned out to be the vilest villain. Standing before him now, the heroine wondered if he was satisfied. What would happen after her death? Would he become the pitiful prince who lost his beloved, or a noble hero who overcame his grief and defeated the demon? Sidal looked at her intently, his face expressing the sincere pain of the impending loss of his beloved. He reached out his hand, wanting to express his heartfelt sympathy to his beloved beauty. Lara demanded an end to this farce, and then, to her surprise, the male protagonist knelt before her. The crowd watched in astonishment as His Highness implored his only love to make this difficult choice for the good of everyone. But at that moment, Sidal, lowering his head and hiding his face, removed his mask of virtue, hoping Lara would just shut up and die. All this time, she had lived well, like a beloved princess and the only saint. Sidal couldn't understand. Wasn't that enough? Did he really have to continue with the confessions and praises? At that moment, he began repeating how much he loved her, praising the girl's beauty. Standing up, he thought Lara should be more compliant, as Sidal could drag her to the altar like a dog on a leash. Hearing that this was her fate, the heroine decided not to endure it any longer. With tears and a smile, she took out a bottle of poison, thinking that the prince shouldn't have betrayed her. She drank the poison in one gulp and began to fall, leaving Sidal in a state of panic and confusion. Seeing her gaze grow dim and blood flow from her mouth, the horrified prince immediately ordered a priest to be summoned. At that moment, the heroine felt a burning pain throughout her body, as if her soul was being torn apart. Thinking that everything was all right, that this wasn't the end, Lara slowly closed her eyes. Suddenly, she woke up in a large bathtub full of water, nearly choking with surprise. Climbing out of the water and catching her breath, she immediately went to the mirror. Looking at her reflection, she was glad to be Laviore Rea Bailey again, and not the saint. She clearly remembered the day in her past life when she was chosen as a sacrifice. Lying in her room then, she heard a voice calling her name, offering her a second chance. The girl was stunned, unsure if it was God's will or the devil's temptation. Either way, it didn't matter, as she immediately agreed, ready to even offer her soul. If this truly was a chance to return to the past, she was willing to give everything. She used to hate how much she resembled her mother, especially her indifferent nature. Lara always thought that if she were like her father, she would definitely win the prince's love. She considered her always busy mother a bad parent, and her often gift-giving father a good one. However, back then she didn't know that despite his outwardly kind demeanor, her father was greedy and vile at heart. To make a good impression on the prince, Rick insisted she had to meet his standards, her father always telling her how to behave. And he also made sure her clothes suited His Highness's tastes. To gain Sidal's attention, she completely lost herself and simply began to do as he said. Lara didn't even know that the prince and the temple were in cahoots with an evil sorcerer, unwittingly taking their side. She contributed to the exile of an innocent princess. Led by His Highness, the heroine also instigated wars between the kingdom and various regions. As a villain wearing the mask of a saint, she brought suffering to those around her. Lost in thought, the girl suddenly heard a familiar scream. Connie was calling her, and Lara hurried to the door and opened it. The maid was glad her mistress had heard her and hoped she hadn't caught a cold from the water. Even though it was summer, Connie asked Laria not to soak in the bath for too long. Connie wanted to fetch a bathrobe to dry Laria, but her mistress stopped her. Carefully observing her mistress's face, the maid couldn't understand why she looked so dejected. Connie had always been attentive. Even if a hint of melancholy crossed Laria's face, she would immediately notice and try to comfort her. Among the Bailey family's maids, Connie was the only one Laria truly liked. When her mistress became the prince's puppet, Connie was deeply disturbed and voiced her disapproval. Of all the maids, she was the only one who disliked the prince and constantly discouraged Laria from getting close to him. The girl believed that if His Highness truly loved her mistress, he wouldn't try to mold her to his standards. Connie knew she was overstepping, but everything felt so wrong to her, and she was incredibly worried about her mistress. But Laria, believing the maid had indeed crossed a line, since the prince could never do such a thing, promptly dismissed her. Now, the mistress painfully recalled how a child who dared to speak the truth was mercilessly cast out. Laria couldn't hold back any longer and hugged the maid tightly, confusing her. The mistress's immense gratitude towards Connie only deepened the maid's confusion. Connie smiled, not understanding why her mistress was acting so strangely today. She assumed Laria had finally read the racy novel that had given her goosebumps, which made Laria burst out laughing. Realizing how many people had suffered because of her, the mistress decided to go back and fix everything. As Connie brushed her hair, Laria thought that to achieve justice, she was even prepared to become a true villain. Once her hair and attire were ready, she decided to confirm something with Connie. Besides wanting to know what day it was, the mistress also wanted to know how her coming-of-age ceremony had gone, which turned out to be a complete mess. The marquee was busy with factional affairs. Her mother was nowhere to be found, and only the invited guests were present. Laria realized she should have already sent her portrait to the prince by now, but more importantly, she wondered if she had met him in person yet. She also learned from a maid that her mother was preparing to leave the estate. Realizing this was happening today, Laria panicked, her gaze falling to the floor. Suddenly, she decided to see her mother immediately, confusing the maid. Almost the entire kingdom referred to Laria's mother, the Marchioness Bailey, as Isadora the Divine. She was the most accomplished Colossus master in the country and was always busy with work. Where her business empire reached astonishing heights, rumors began to circulate that she had even bought her husband with money. These rumors stemmed from the fact that Laria's parents hated each other and were known as the worst couple in the country. And starting from their daughter's coming-of-age ceremony, they finally separated. In her past life, Laria sided with her father, lashed out at her mother, and decided they would be strangers from then on. But even after that, her mother continued to send letters, helping her maintain her sanity. There was nothing particularly special in the letters, but every word showed her mother's genuine concern for her daughter. If Laria had known what would happen, she would have asked to be sent back even further before her parents' marriage. Then she would have begged her mother not to give birth to her, not to marry the marquis. Because if Laria had never been born, her mother could have lived a life freer than anyone else's. The reason being, in the girl's eyes, her mother was the coolest and most capable woman in the world. As Laria rushed into the street, she saw her mother standing by the carriage and stopped abruptly. She had come running full of confidence, but now fear was spreading through her heart. In her mind, it was entirely possible her mother hated her because usually she didn't care about her mother at all, and if she could, she wanted to apologize immediately for all her past mistakes. Seeing her mother start to board the carriage, she realized there was no time to waste and rushed forward, shouting and grabbing her mother's sleeve. Her sudden appearance startled her mother. Panting, Laria only hoped her mother wouldn't leave her and would listen to her explanation. Isadora, holding her daughter's shoulders, decided to find out what was going on first. Not wanting her mother to leave, Laria knew deep down that her mother had probably never been happy in this house. And so, with tears in her eyes, she began to plead with her mother to divorce her father. Afterwards, the two of them boarded the carriage together and remained silent for a long time. Looking at the cityscape through the window, the mistress didn't know how to start a conversation, and the atmosphere was very awkward. She realized that for the past 10 years, she and her mother had lived like strangers. Looking at her mother now, Laria understood that the woman felt just as awkward as she did. In this situation, she decided to ask why her parents hadn't divorced yet. The woman smiled, thinking that Laria had finally decided to take responsibility for her choices. It turned out that her relationship with Laria's father had long since ended. However, Isadora had promised herself that she wouldn't leave the marquee, at least not until her daughter became an adult. The woman also understood when her daughter didn't want her to attend her coming-of-age ceremony. It was probably because Laria felt abandoned when she learned her mother was leaving the estate. Hearing that she hadn't wanted her mother to be present, Laria was shocked. She was horrified by her past actions, unable to control her emotions, and sincerely apologized to her mother. Seeing her daughter apologize in tears before her, Isadora was stunned. Laria also wanted to know what her mother would do if a deity appeared and gave her a chance to go back in time. To the young woman's surprise, even with such an opportunity, the woman would never take it. The reason was that she had something precious here, Isadora said, gazing mysteriously out the window. Of course, she was referring to her precious daughter, whom she couldn't abandon. Feeling warmth in her chest, Laria smiled sincerely and confessed to her mother that she loved her very much. Surprised by her words, her mother decided that if Laria had any problems, she could come to her anytime. Furthermore, Laria no longer needed to obey her father's orders, a point the young woman completely agreed with. After sending Isadora back to the family estate, the carriage carried Laria back home. Later, sitting in her room at the Bailey estate, she felt it was better that her mother had decided to leave. Laria understood that the estate would become quite noisy, and she didn't want her mother to get caught up in the trouble. In her past life, even when she was ruining her own destiny, her mother had tried to stop her. No matter what happened, she was determined to protect her daughter, hoping she would listen. But the proud and sarcastic Laria had just scoffed at her, wanting to handle everything herself. In the end, she had died before her parents, probably the worst daughter imaginable. Now, recalling those days, Laria realized that her mother had truly loved her with all her heart. Even when she was strict and seemed frightening, she had actually always been on her daughter's side. No matter what mistakes Laria made, even when everything seemed irreparable, her mother had always extended a helping hand. Now, the young woman was incredibly grateful to fate for giving her this chance to tell her mother how much she loved her. Meanwhile, the painter finally arrived to paint Laria's portrait and sent it to the prince. The maids and Connie hurriedly began selecting a white dress and matching jewelry. But unexpectedly, Lady Laria wanted to wear a dress the color of blood. Soon after, she walked into the painter's room wearing a deep wine-red dress that shimmered in the light. Satisfied and happy, she wanted the painter to depict her exactly as she was, without adding any embellishments. During the painting process, Connie approached the young lady several times, carrying a tray with refreshments. Laria knew that noble women of Otana didn't wear red dresses, as the color was common among the middle and lower classes. Therefore, with the prince's unique tastes, he wouldn't be interested in such a portrait at all. Laria was glad she had returned to the past at this time, before they had met. This was her chance to erase Sidal from her life. There were still many things to take care of, so Laria and Connie headed to the Colosseum. The maid, who had always considered her a quiet and reserved person, was quite surprised by this decision. At that moment, Laria thought that Connie would be in for even bigger surprises. The maid wondered how the Marquis would react if he found out about this outing. However, Laria was calm, knowing that this kind of thing wouldn't cause her father to scold her. The atmosphere inside the arena was unexpectedly pleasant and spacious. Suddenly, Connie spotted the battle records for the month, which she immediately wanted to look at. Finding a rather handsome warrior there, she quickly pointed him out to Laria, making the young woman laugh. Learning that the young lady intended to buy a slave here, the maid was puzzled, but even more surprised that Laria was looking for a specific person. His name was Damian Rhode Drake, a slave from the Estragon Empire who later became the strongest gladiator. He was also the person who suffered great misfortune because of Laria. When he was still a slave in the arena, Laria, as the princess, had declared him a spy stealing information from Otana's nobles. She had done so at the prince's request, unaware that it was all a lie. Because he was accused of something he didn't do, he became the prince's slave and was even sent to the battlefield. Furthermore, Laria had also turned the priests of the temple against him. Because of her lies, Damian was persecuted and suffered greatly, but he never blamed Laria. Instead, before every battle, he wondered if winning would make Laria stop hating him. Time and again, before every battle, he asked himself this question. Laria always agreed, but one day, he suddenly wondered when she would stop making false promises. Seeing the confusion in Laria's eyes, he lowered his head, not understanding why she hated him. That very night, with the help of his companions, he escaped, leaving the Atana Empire forever. Laria couldn't understand why he never blamed her, even though she was his true enemy. As she pondered this, she found his picture among the battle participants. Suddenly, a noise came from nearby. Seeing two men pulling a cart filled with slaves, she immediately ran towards them. As she approached, she discovered Damian locked in a wooden cage. She froze. First, she decided to confirm with Connie if this slave was on today's auction list. Noticing his gaze fall upon her, Laria believed he was capable of killing everyone present instantly. She understood that she might not be able to atone for all her past sins, but she was certain she didn't hate him. Without a chance to tell him everything, she decided that at least in this life, she wouldn't let Damian be alone. Connie discovered that the slave had arrived just this morning, and they didn't know when he would be auctioned. The maid felt a little sorry for him, because if no one bought him, he would be sent to the mines. However, Laria pitied the people who had transported Damian. He must have done something to be captured. As she continued walking, entering the drawing room, Connie was stunned by the luxurious surroundings. The ladies sitting nearby, seeing Laria, decided to inquire where this country girl with straw-like hair had come from. The maid wanted to leave immediately, but Laria found these ladies rather endearing. Besides, they were just gossipy ants who enjoyed talking behind people's backs. Suddenly, an arena staff member entered the hall, summoning all the guests to the upcoming matches and the subsequent auction. Laria decided she definitely had to go, much to Connie's surprise. Having stumbled upon Damian, she was determined to be his supporter. Before the matches began, a staff member informed the guests that they were taking care of the newly arrived slaves. Then came the first match, featuring the arena's top clients and great warriors, Lady Sweevy and Lady Duan. Connie couldn't wait to see who would win, but according to Laria, the outcome was obvious. Lady Duan's warrior would win. His clothes were more luxurious, and his sword was clearly more expensive, indicating thorough preparation. As soon as the match began, Lady Duan's warrior quickly lunged, instantly striking his opponent and disarming him. Afterward, he presented the sword to his mistress and had the honor of kissing her hand. While Connie squealed with excitement, Laria wondered when Damian would appear. Suddenly, a tall figure emerged behind the announcer, who joyfully declared the start of the auction. Besides Damian, several other people also came out, and the noble ladies immediately snatched them up for dozens of gold coins. Damian was last, with jet black hair, which seemed rather unusual in these parts. The ladies looked at the thin, hunched-over, scruffy fellow with disgust, probably thinking he hadn't even bathed. Laria smiled at him and immediately ordered Connie to buy him. The maid looked at the slave in shock, then back at her mistress, thinking Laria had gone mad. After all, if you were looking for someone, it was better to do so at a night ball, not here, where you could only find a one-night stand. But having no other choice, Connie confidently offered the auctioneer 2 gold coins for the slave. Shockingly, no one offered a higher price. The auctioneer agreed, and Damian was bewildered. Laria laughed, finding it ironic that she had bought the future king of crime for 2 gold coins. Later, sitting in the waiting room, Damian thought about how he had done everything to make himself look unattractive, yet was sold for only 2 gold coins. It wasn't even enough to buy a shabby sword. He had never thought he would be treated this way. Suddenly, Connie entered, wanting to give Damian a gift from her mistress. Afterward, 4 men entered the room, struggling to carry a wooden chest, which they placed on the floor. Before Damian could understand what was happening, Connie quickly walked toward the exit. Damian calmly approached the chest and opened it, curious about its contents. Seeing the top-tier equipment inside, he cried out in delight, determined to meet the owner as soon as possible. In her past life, Laria often saw the maids pretending to happily clean her room. Afterward, they would fuss over her, praising her and believing the prince was the luckiest man in the world to have the love of such a girl. Laria, overwhelmed by their concern and care, decided she absolutely had to bring these maids to the royal palace. However, the maids later overheard her asking her father about it, only to be flatly refused. As she descended the stairs, she pondered how best to tell them, hoping they would understand. But suddenly, she overheard the maids mocking her behind her back, speaking ill of her. Just like before, the maids, having finished cleaning Laria's room, looked at their mistress expectantly. But to their surprise, Laria decided that since they had completed their work, they should leave immediately. The maids were shocked, thinking she might have eaten something strange, especially since she had given them pocket money and treated them to snacks not long ago. Yet now, their mistress only wanted Connie to stay. The others had to leave at once. Alone with her, the maid guessed that her mistress was truly disappointed in the others. Laria pretended this wasn't the case, but regardless, it was all in the past. People were selfish nowadays, and the maids were merely showing their true nature. The real problem was that Sidal would approach the protagonist sooner or later, because even if he didn't like her portrait, the prince needed Marquee Bailey. Laria knew her father wouldn't let her move out and live on her own, as in their social circle, eldest daughters were bargaining chips in political dealings. Connie was curious when her mistress would go see the slave, as a whole day had passed since his purchase, but the girl decided to wait until she was utterly bored before going to the arena. The more pressing matter was figuring out how to escape the control of the prince and her father. Her father was greedy for money and power, and although all their wealth was earned by her mother, he never acknowledged her contribution to the family finances. Prince Sidal was much the same. He needed a respectable woman who could solidify his reputation. What these two men had in common was their dislike for extravagant women who were always the subject of gossip, and she needed to become just that. Suddenly, she remembered Connie recently asking her when she would go see the slave she had bought. Thinking of a brilliant plan, she looked at the maid gratefully, leaving the latter bewildered. Laria realized she needed to become a true villain, not a villain disguised as a saint. Heading to the gladiatorial games, the protagonist was surprised to find Damian also participating. Connie was embarrassed by her mistress wearing a bright red, everyday dress and wanted to check with the designer. But this too was part of Laria's plan, and she decided the designer could wait. At this point, she had saved 2,000 gold coins in pocket money, which she wanted to invest generously. Entering the VIP lounge of the arena, Connie was horrified to find it, packed with noble ladies. Laria, thrilled by this, hopped onto a nearby sofa, throwing her legs over it. The maid sitting next to her mentally resolved to keep this a secret from the Marchioness and everyone else. Sure enough, the surrounding ladies were whispering, discussing the girl's slovenliness and rudeness. Suddenly, the announcer introduced two great warriors who would fight for the honor of their ladies. Connie remembered one of them achieving a landslide victory the previous day, while Laria was shocked. This guy was in big trouble. As for him, it was just a game, and he might not even fight properly. But his opponent, Damian, was a completely different story. He only knew how to win. So Laria sincerely hoped the great warrior facing him would at least survive. Before the fight began, the confident warrior decided to pay his compliments to the lady, who was already captivated by Damian's powerful physique. Knowing it was the hero's first time here, the opponent apologized in advance and began swinging his sword. Damian easily sidestepped the blade, kicking the warrior in the stomach. The kick sent the opponent flying several meters, instantly knocking him unconscious. His mistress was bewildered, and the announcer, unable to contain his emotions, admitted it was the first time he had seen such a fight. At that moment, Laria thanked God the hero hadn't used his sword. Afterward, the announcer introduced the victor's mistress, who was descending from the stands. Damian began walking towards her slowly and confidently, wanting to dedicate his victory to Lady Bailey. The hero knelt before her, taking her hand to kiss, but first, he wanted to know her name. After apologizing in advance, the protagonist decided to kiss him immediately, pressing her body against his. Initially, she hadn't planned on doing this, but she decided to take the risk anyway. Because she kissed a slave in public, Laria was now considered a frivolous troublemaker by the social circle. After revealing her name, Damian suddenly picked the girl up, leaving her bewildered. He wrapped his arms around her head, bringing his face close to hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Laria had intended to create a small scandal, but now it seemed she would be seen as a truly wanton woman. Later, standing in Damian's room, she thought about how she really didn't want to use him like this. However, Laria didn't understand what the hero was thinking when he kissed her. But Damian did it simply because he wanted to. Did he really need a reason? Then the girl thought he must want something from her. But this thought also proved wrong. Laria still couldn't calm down, wondering why he was so reckless, as if he truly craved her. The hero himself didn't know what he wanted, as he had never made such a decision before. At this moment, Laria remembered that in her past life, she was the same, not knowing her true desires, only obeying orders. Damian was a man born a slave, his whole life spent on the battlefield. Although she was a noble, she also lacked freedom, and in this respect they were very similar. Turning to face the hero, Laria decided to ask him directly if he wanted to live. However, the hero realized they were already living, which made the girl wonder if he wanted to die. Later, she discovered he didn't want to leave, eat, acquire new things, see anyone, learn new skills, and more. Completely bewildered, she decided to find out if he wanted to start a family or seek revenge. Receiving another negative answer, she became curious about why he came to Otana. It turned out he discovered by chance that being a slave in the arena could earn a lot of money. Knowing this was only a partial truth, and the most important thing was to make Damian happy, she decided to set him free just like that. In response, the hero offered her a deal to become his master for the next 6 months. He was well aware that such a slave was something to be proud of. Laria looked at him, bewildered, frantically thinking about what this man was planning. Deciding that regardless, the title of master was a good excuse to meet, Laria agreed to his proposal. As they grew closer, Damian would realize that her enemy was Prince Sidar, and they just needed to wait a little. Suddenly, Connie screamed from outside, saying that someone had come to the mansion for her mistress. It turned out the marquee was furious and ordered the portrait to be immediately repainted and returned. Laria knew that now her father might order his men to deal with the hero. But Damian didn't understand what was so bad about her father knowing everything. The problem was that rumors tended to be exaggerated, so the marquis might think their relationship was serious. Then the hero learned from the girl that her father had no master swordsman, no mage, not even a knight loyal to the family. Knowing this, he couldn't understand how her father could possibly kill him. He decided to promise his mistress that he would never die, but Laria wanted him to start calling her by her name. Damian happily agreed and suddenly tossed a purse he had snatched from Laria into the air. This meant the slave could take care of his own needs, so now Laria felt reassured about that. Connie started urging her mistress, and the hero decided to find out when she would come to him again. The girl, thinking she would come soon, left, with Damian thinking first. He needed to calm down. With no hometown, parents, or even a name, he lived and learned to fight on the battlefields of the Estragon Empire. He mastered spear fighting from a knight, swordsmanship from a mercenary, and strategy from a general. Along the way, people recognized his talent, but he didn't join any side, living as a wandering slave for 24 years. No matter how much he drank, got drunk, or even saw beautiful women, he didn't care. Furthermore, Damian didn't have anything he wanted to possess, do, or achieve. However, to his surprise, his new mistress was a completely different type of woman, the one who came to the arena completely uninterested in him. Why was she looking at the hero so warily? This was definitely their first meeting, but why did she look so familiar? Damian couldn't understand why she looked at him as if she knew him well. He was filled with curiosity about this, feeling an unprecedented yearning for a new encounter. So he believed Laviore Rea Bailey owed him a reason to return soon. Meanwhile, Laria walked outside, and as soon as a group of noble women saw her, they started gossiping. The noble women couldn't understand how she could be so shameless. If it were them, they would want to crawl into a hole. Hearing all the scorn and insults directed at her mistress, Connie immediately wanted to defend her. But Laria herself only felt happy because this was finally the opportunity she had been waiting for. After all, with time, all these rumors would only become more exaggerated. Seeing the maid's indignation, Laria declared loudly that the noble women must be jealous and gossiping about her out of spite. Since they were powerless and wanted to continue their backbiting, they were welcome to do so. After all, it wouldn't make the slave any uglier, but it would make her, Laria, even more famous. Hearing these words, the noble women were dumbfounded, looking at the girl in bewilderment. Laria, giving a farewell smile, hurried into the carriage with Connie. She knew her father was furious and had already sent knights to watch her. To outsiders, it would just look like a father caring for his beloved daughter. In any case, after what happened today, the girl felt wonderful. Upon returning home, Laria learned that the marquee had fired the artist who painted her portrait and hired another painter and designer, also demanding she throw away the vulgar dress. Furthermore, he forbade her from appearing at the arena again, suggesting she'd be better off attending embroidery or book clubs. In 3 days, she had to go to the temple, wearing a veil to cover her face and pretend to pray all night. The marquis had already spoken to the priest, bribing him to keep silent. Laria was shocked that he was trying to twist the truth and bribe the temple servants. After giving all the instructions, her father wanted to make sure she understood, but Laria just stared at him silently. At that moment, our heroine firmly confessed that she didn't want to marry Prince Sidar at all. The Marquis took this as a joke, demanding his daughter immediately stop this foolish behavior. He suspected she wanted to follow in the footsteps of that ungrateful woman. Laria was furious. He had insulted not only her, but also her mother. Just then, the Marquis's servant entered, wanting to inform his master of the latest news. From his expression, the heroine immediately knew it was about the incident at the arena. Her father angrily asked what all this meant. Laria, with a satisfied smile, fully admitted that it was indeed true. Moreover, putting on a confident look, she pretended she had even slept with the slave. The Marquis, unable to tolerate such audacity, immediately jumped up and slapped his daughter. He grabbed her by the collar, enraged that she dared to tarnish his reputation. The father immediately locked Laria in her room, forbidding her from going out. When the girl asked if she really couldn't go out, she received another slap, accompanied by her father's angry roar. Shocked and bewildered by her behavior, the Marquis demanded unconditional obedience from his daughter. He stationed 2 guards at her door, ordering that anyone who brought her food or let her out would be immediately expelled. Furthermore, the Marquis paid his men to dispose of the slave as soon as possible, leaving no trace. After 3 days of starvation, when thoughts of threatening suicide began to surface, Laria suddenly heard Connie's voice. The heroine barely opened her eyes, not understanding how her maid had gotten in. Hearing that her mother had arrived, the girl looked at Connie in surprise. It turned out that her mother, upon learning what had happened, immediately rushed over and gave the Marquis a severe scolding. Afterward, she slapped him and demanded the secretary bring the divorce papers immediately. The decision came so swiftly, as if she had been preparing for it all along. The maid happily brought her mistress a plate of food, knowing she was hungry. Laria had been hungry for so long she had even forgotten how hungry she was, but the sight of food instantly reminded her. However, now was not the time to eat. Learning her mother was in the Marquis's office, she immediately rushed there. The guards tried to stop her, but the heroine pushed them aside. Laria wasn't worried about her mother's safety, as even her father feared her mother, but the question was why she had suddenly changed her mind about the divorce. The girl pushed open the door to the Marquis's office and heard her father's desperate cries, not understanding why the divorce was happening. But the woman refused to leave her daughter in the house of such a scoundrel who would even raise a hand against her. Her mother wanted to take Laria away immediately after the Marquis signed the divorce papers. The heroine, mustering her courage, decided to protect her mother no matter what. Suddenly, her mother's secretary appeared, directing the girl back to her room to pack her things. He understood her desire to stop her father, but it was time to trust her mother. Returning to her room before dinner, Laria heard Connie's voice asking if she should start packing. The heroine learned that the maid had confessed to her mother that the Marquis had not only hid her, but also starved her like a prisoner. Laria's mother already knew the reason behind her father's actions. From the slave's name to the fact they bought him for 2 gold coins, her mother was aware of everything. Laria suddenly realized her mother had been wanting a divorce for a long time, but had been enduring the situation, possibly worried that her daughter would blame her. After packing, Laria and her mother boarded the same carriage, while Connie rode in another, barely suppressing her laughter. Her mother recalled how they had bought a slave for a mere 2 gold coins. Laria thought her mother was displeased with her, but the woman simply wanted to know how they had determined the man's worth. Laria realized that, in her mother's eyes, she had always been an obedient child who didn't concern herself with such matters. But now everything had drastically changed. Now, Laria no longer avoided conversations, but instead chose her words carefully. Seeing her lost in thought, her mother wondered when her daughter had become so mature. Unable to contain her curiosity, she asked Laria directly what had happened. Laria confessed that she had indeed admired the prince, but now she realized he would do anything for the throne. Her father was the same. For the prince's coronation, he was prepared to turn his own daughter into a puppet. So, she deliberately made herself appear vulgar and unbearable, hoping to prevent this. She knew it was a reckless act and expected to be scolded. Her mother chuckled, wondering why she would scold her. After all, the opinions of others didn't matter. Isadora would always support and believe in her. Knowing Laria had left everything behind, and that everything in this world required money, her mother handed her a purse. Of course, as a mother would. She didn't approve of her daughter's methods. After all, what mother would enjoy others gossiping about their child? But she wasn't going to interfere with Laria or impose her own ways, especially if her daughter might have a better plan. Isadora was prepared to offer her unwavering support, regardless of the rumors, as long as Laria promised to take care of herself. Otherwise, if she controlled her daughter's every move, how would she be any different from her father? Laria couldn't hold back any longer. Tears welled up as she rushed into her mother's arms, filled with gratitude. When Laria and Connie arrived, they were astonished by the size and luxury of Isadora's mansion, even grander than the marquee's. Sebastian, the secretary, and the maids welcomed them warmly with a grand reception. It turned out Laria's belongings wouldn't even begin to fill her new wardrobe, so they needed to go shopping immediately. Seeing the mansion bustling with life, Laria decided to explore it slowly. Also, unsure of Damian's current situation, Laria and Connie went to see him in the evening. At the entrance to the arena, they met the person responsible for reporting on the hero's condition, as Laria had requested. Due to the attack, the staff hadn't been able to send anyone to her home. However, in the past 3 days, the number of challengers wanting to duel Damian had surged to dozens, and his ransom had skyrocketed to 300 gold coins. Therefore, the staff hoped the owner would quickly set a date for the duel or send the slave to auction. After listening carefully, Laria decided to discuss the matter with Damian. Suddenly, the door opened, and there he was, overjoyed to see her. But his expression immediately turned serious. Approaching her, he demanded to know who had hit her. Deciding to speak privately, he embraced her tightly, lifted her up, and carried her to his room, closing the door. Glancing at the bewildered expressions of Connie and the others, Laria realized this was another scandal about to erupt. After he set her down in a chair, Laria immediately asked about the attack. It turned out there had been 3 assassination attempts on the hero, resulting in 5 deaths. Although Damian was unharmed, he couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the work of Laria's father. Reading the truth in her face, he immediately drew his sword, ready to kill him. But that wasn't what Laria wanted, and they had a soiree to attend that evening. These were parties held by nobles every night at different locations, open house, everything on display like an exhibition. But sometimes, the balls were only open to those with invitations. If the arena was the nobles' twisted playground, then the soirees were a space several levels higher. Laria wanted to dance with Damian and then accompany him to the hotel entrance. After he agreed, they set off immediately as they needed to prepare properly. First, they headed to a high-end boutique in a luxurious shopping mall in the city center. Laria wanted the shop assistant to forget her noble status and bring out the most luxurious, eye-catching dress. When she mentioned she planned to wear it to a soiree, the other customers began whispering, and the saleswoman decided to take the mistress to the VIP room. Following Connie's advice, the dress couldn't be white or too revealing. After confirming that ribbons were preferred over flowers, the saleswoman presented a dark blue short dress with lace. Laria immediately wanted to try it on. When Connie saw her in it, she wondered if it was too much for a noble lady. Considering the mistress would be dancing, Damian thought the dress was a good choice, as it was very light and wouldn't restrict movement. The young lady found the hero quite practical and wondered how well he danced. It turned out Damian could imitate any movement after seeing it just once. Laria, satisfied, decided to pick out an outfit for him. A deep neck shirt, tight leather pants, knee-high boots, a loose tie with a red lining, and finally, a coat. Damian was surprised about the coat, thinking it would be too hot, but the mistress believed it would be perfect for the next stage. The hero still didn't understand. It should be about taking clothes off, not putting more on. But that was Laria's plan, to take off the coat during the performance and show off his muscles. Later, in the carriage on the way to the party, Connie wasn't sure it was a good idea, as even the surrounding lights felt tacky. The maid knew the ambience and the music would be in the same style, and the food would likely taste the same too. But for Laria, the most important thing was to keep Damian by her side, especially since someone might attack him. She suspected someone would try to provoke or seduce one of them. Just then, they finally arrived at their destination, and Damian, agreeing with everything she said, invited her to join the party. However, soon all her expectations were shattered, leaving her quite displeased. They danced beautifully, and she thought that would be enough. But the place was filled with drunken clamor and vulgar language, with unfinished food thrown on the floor. Laria realized that compared to this, her actions were mere child's play, and she kept receiving malicious stares. Seeing her distress, Damian decided they could leave and go home anytime she wanted. Suddenly, Lady Duan appeared, commenting on how well the mistress handled her liquor. Of course, there was no class discrimination at this party, but according to these ladies, bringing a slave was going too far. Laria retorted that if she didn't have enough money to buy a slave, she could at least borrow some. Damian, laughing, pointed out that he'd become more sensitive since she started playing the villain. But suddenly, he felt an urge to help the girl, which left her a bit confused. The hero assured her that if she continued like this, she wouldn't become the most scandalous woman in Otana. Laria was curious about what he was planning, but Damian himself wasn't quite sure. One thing he was certain of, he wouldn't let her face this alone. Suddenly, he walked straight past Lady Duan, leaving both her and Laria bewildered. He approached a guest who recognized him as the infamous lady's companion. In that instant, the hero swiftly kicked him in the face, knocking the man to the ground. With his foot on the man's head, Damian asked who this staring fellow was. Quickly, a small crowd gathered around, looking on in confusion. Suddenly turning to a group of young men who were watching him, the hero bewildered them, but seeing him walking towards them, these men became seriously afraid, thinking, wasn't he a slave? As Damian stood before them, they wondered whose slave he was exactly, but in the same second, the hero knocked all three down with one blow and started beating each one in turn. Laria tried to stop him, not understanding what Damian was thinking. Now she wished he would flee Otana, return to his empire, and was even willing to cover his travel expenses herself. Hearing he didn't want to do that, the mistress thought Damian was seeking his own execution, but the hero considered himself Laria's champion, her warrior. If she didn't like something, he was ready to get rid of it, no matter what it was. Just then, a man appeared behind the girl, holding a vase in both hands. About to throw it at them, Damian caught the vase and immediately smashed it over the attacker's head. He hoped Laria would bring him something tasty when she visited him in jail later. The hero was arrested, and the girl ended up at the police station. Recalling everything that happened, the mistress couldn't understand what Damian was thinking. The police officer sat across from her, wanting to confirm if she was indeed Marquee Bailey's daughter. He also inquired about her relationship with the slave. It turned out the hero was her personal warrior. The police officer mused that such a man shouldn't be called a warrior, but more like a lover. He then handed her a document, asking her to sign away ownership of the slave and agree to his punishment. Upon learning the punishment meant death, Laria immediately refused, leaving the officer perplexed. She tore up the document, stating that if they wanted her signature, they would have to let her see Damian. She knew they couldn't force her to sign, and that if the criminal was someone's slave, he couldn't be tried like everyone else. The officer was apprehensive, believing the slave to be extremely dangerous, and if everyone found out, things would only get worse. Realizing this was pointless, the officer sent someone to the Bailey mansion, wanting to meet with the young lady tomorrow. Just as Laria was about to leave, she heard the door open and the Marquee Bailey's servant walked into the office. Hearing that her father was taking her back, Laria was instantly terrified and thrown into turmoil. She tried to refuse and struggle, but the servant grabbed her arm, forcibly dragging her towards the carriage. Looking at the nearby police, Laria realized they wouldn't help her, and even if she bit her tongue and bled now, it certainly wouldn't stop the servant. Suddenly, Lady Duan and her friend were there, angrily shouting at the servant who was dragging Laria. Laria was shocked that they decided to intervene, as they could have just stood by and watched. The noble women fiercely defended the girl, demanding that she be released, which truly surprised Laria, as she thought they hated her. Then, Lady Duan's friends started shouting in the street about Marquee Bailey treating his daughter like a dog. The girls were all scared, thinking the Marquis was beating his daughter and locking her up. Their shouts grew louder and louder until they attracted a crowd, which completely frightened the servant. He decided to leave quickly, tugging at Laria's sleeve, but just then, Lady Duan's friend walked towards him. The servant, startled, turned towards her, and at that moment, the lady fell to the ground, pretending to have been hit. Lady Duan flew into a rage, accusing the audacious man of attacking other nobles as well, and demanded that the police and a doctor be called. She glared furiously at the servant, deciding this was the final warning. If the servants didn't leave or forcibly took Lara, they would immediately spread rumors that they had kidnapped, beaten, and humiliated her. And no matter how high the marquee's status, he wouldn't care about the lives of these servants. Hearing this, the servants immediately released Lara. They hurried away. Lady Duan approached Lara, wanting her to come with them. Receiving her consent, they happily invited Lara into their carriage. Later, sitting across from them, Lara learned that Lady Duan's name was Eunice and her friend, Lady Sweevy, was called Jimena. Thanking them for their help, Lara didn't understand why they had done this in the first place. It turned out they were quite interested in her, although she had indeed annoyed them at first. A model student praised by everyone suddenly barged into their territory and snatched a handsome slave. However, the more these noble women observed this stranger, the more vulgar, in Eunice's opinion, the kiss in the arena and that tacky red dress appeared. Later, seeing Lara at the evening ball, it was clear from her expression that she wasn't enjoying herself, and her slave had even beaten up some nobles. In Eunice's view, if Lara wanted to be a true villain, she had to do some bad things, but for what reason? Jimena was certain Miss Bailey was doing this on purpose because the marquee was trying to force her into a ridiculous arranged marriage. Lara was shocked, not understanding how they knew this, but Lady Sweevy believed this was the typical reason for such behavior. Jimena's father was a gambler, and when she discovered he had gambled away the portion of her inheritance left to her by her grandfather, she set fire to his bedroom. As for Eunice, she discovered her stepmother had been tormenting her, actually seducing her father and driving her mother out onto the streets. In retaliation, Lady Duan squandered all her money on lavish parties, and now, recalling these things, the girls felt a great sense of delight. Eunice had once been locked in the prayer room for reformation, just like the marquee had locked Lara in her room. So Jimena decided to give Lara a piece of advice. If she wasn't ready to give up everything and hit rock bottom, her actions could bring her a lot of pain. Hearing this, our heroine fell into deep thought, observing them carefully, realizing they were actually kind girls. They had to become villains to survive, but in reality, they weren't bad at all. Even now, they were willing to get down on the ground and dirty themselves for a girl in the same predicament. Suddenly, Lara had an idea. She felt that if this were her past life, she wouldn't have been able to do this, but things were different now. She thanked Eunice and Jimena for helping her understand what was truly important. She needed to start by cleaning up the garbage in her life, but the protagonist didn't seem to particularly notice this. She decided to give up the family name she inherited from her father, along with all the privileges of nobility. The two ladies' jaws dropped, staring at Lara in shock as they digested what they had just heard. Now, the protagonist wished for her father, obsessed with illusory power, to die alone in a house devoid of wife and child. The next day, Lara went to see Damian, who had broken the nobleman's limbs and knocked out his teeth in a fight with the knights, yet remained completely unharmed himself. The reason was his frantic love for his mistress. He protected her so fiercely that anyone who even glanced at Lara would be struck down by him. Meanwhile, our hero was leisurely staying in his cell, eating the sandwiches his mistress had bought him, eager to hear her thoughts on all of this. Moreover, he was curious if people were still saying his mistress was so beautiful that a slave completely forgot his own identity. The protagonist knew people were saying more than that. Many believed Damian should be executed. But the hero was calm because, according to him, the Crown Prince of Estragon could grant him immunity. He had saved the Crown Prince on the battlefield, earning this immunity, and now even the investigator must know the name Damian Drake. Lara was shocked, certain that the hero had only received the surname Drake when he became the king of the No Man's Land. Having a surname meant he couldn't possibly be a slave, so Connie was confused as to why he was pretending. But to Damian, slave and commoner were the same, just as dying on the battlefield and being executed made no difference. The protagonist gaped, finding this impossible, because in her past life, the hero had been treated as a slave until he escaped. In this life, only she had changed, but everything else should have followed the original trajectory. And that meant there was no reason for him to be locked up in the first place in her past life. Lara pondered why he had deliberately allowed himself to be captured, but couldn't figure out Damian's reason for doing so. Suddenly, the hero noticed that the girl had previously looked at him as if she knew him well, but now she looked at him like a stranger. Lara didn't answer the question, instead deciding to find out why he had come to Otana. However, Damian didn't respond, leaving the protagonist perplexed. Suddenly, a police officer barged in, calling for Miss Bailey. It turned out that someone claiming to be her mother's secretary had arrived, causing quite a stir. Just then, Sebastian appeared behind him, and Lara decided to ask what was going on. It turned out the secretary had come to post bail for the hero who had protected his young mistress. While Otana was a weak kingdom, it was still outside the Empire's influence. If the kingdom executed such a special person from the Estragon Empire, it would risk a major conflict between Otana and Estragon. Coupled with Isadora's considerable wealth and the commotion she had caused, even the security forces couldn't handle it now. So the case was reported to higher authorities. After receiving the news from a servant, the prince began to consider how to handle the situation. Sida Otana, the king's eldest son, was capable, but second only to his younger sister. When the prince realized he had to fight for the throne, his first thought was the vacant position of his spouse. Now, reading about the recent events, he kept repeating the name Laviore Rea Bailey. He couldn't understand why such a complicated name was used, but it turned out the marquee was fascinated by aristocratic matters. Sida looked at the portrait sent by the marquee family, seeing Lara in a blood-red dress. The prince was puzzled. The marquis was eager to make his daughter a princess, but why was she dressed like that? It turned out the hero had invited another painter to redo the portrait, but because his daughter wasn't home, it hadn't been successful. According to the servants, the marquis was divorcing Isadora, and rumor had it that his daughter had left with her mother. Sida knew the nobleman was a card that couldn't be easily discarded, as many nobles respected him. The prince believed he couldn't stand by and watch his close friend become destitute after the divorce. So Sida ordered the Marchioness to demand an exorbitant amount of alimony. The prince also planned to intervene, ensuring no one dared to be too arrogant, and he was planning to invite them all to the upcoming banquet. As for the slave, Sida decided to release him and ordered reasonable compensation for the victims. He believed that from this moment on, the fight for the throne had begun, and he couldn't afford any friction with the Empire. In less than a week, Damian was released from prison. During that time, Lara visited him twice a day with delicacies from the finest restaurants, hoping he wouldn't want to return to the arena. However, after his release, the hero still decided to go back, as it provided him with food, clothing, shelter, and money. Later, while having dinner with her mother, Lara thought that she might soon need to ask permission to bring Damian home. Meanwhile, Isadora was thinking about how the Marquis had recently threatened to leave her destitute, having learned that Sida was trying to prevent their divorce. The heroine was shocked. Her mother knew that it was His Highness who had advised the Marquis to demand alimony. He did this for the sake of the noble's power and wealth, and this marriage was politically necessary for the prince. Lara decided that she must help her mother resolve this issue, but Isadora strongly objected. The heroine thought that, unlike in her past life, this time Isadora sincerely wanted a divorce, and even Sida had decided to intervene. Although Lara didn't know much, her determination to help her mother remained firm. Before leaving, her mother said that if her daughter needed extra cash, she could always ask her. Meanwhile, the girl was thinking about what would be best to expose first. If her father started receiving harsh criticism, it would be easier for her mother to get a divorce. And this criticism had to be so severe that even the prince couldn't take his side. A scandal would be ideal, but the Marquis did have a good reputation. At the same time, corruption and crime completely tainted his private life. He colluded with the temple, provoked conflicts among the nobles, and sold false information. Moreover, he was jealous of his wife's greater success and had affairs with commoners who only valued his status and money. That's why Lara was determined to gather such irrefutable evidence that he wouldn't be able to get away easily. She decided to go all out to ensure that her father wouldn't get a single penny in the divorce from her mother. Just then, Sebastian approached her, happy to find her on her walk. To be absolutely sure, he wanted to clarify that if the young lady needed to discuss anything, she could tell him at any time. Furthermore, he wanted to give her the invitation he had taken from his briefcase. Seeing the royal crest on the letter, the heroine was slightly surprised. It turned out to be from Sida, inviting her to his banquet. In her past life, everyone called it the banquet for choosing a crown princess candidate, but Lara hadn't attended. By her father's decision, she was only allowed to see the prince in the prayer hall, not the banquet hall. But now, the most pressing issue wasn't choosing a crown princess candidate, but the assassination attempt on Princess Sonia. Although she didn't know how to prevent it yet, Lara realized that only she could resolve this situation. Seeing her expression, Sebastian thought that if the young lady didn't want to attend the banquet, she didn't have to. However, after giving her secretary a firm look, the heroine resolutely decided to go. The prince wouldn't be interested in her anyway, and the girl had other plans. She asked her secretary if her mother could receive alimony if her father was held responsible for the divorce. Having received an affirmative answer, Lara was thrilled because now the marquee had no choice but to sign the divorce papers. She wanted to facilitate this herself, but first needed to disgrace her father publicly. Her father wanted the prince to ascend the throne, while his daughter was going to save the princess from danger. People would definitely talk about how they supported different candidates, and this betrayal would shake her father. Satisfied with this arrangement, the heroine decided to start preparing for the banquet. Shortly after, she met with Eunice and Jimena, who wanted to help her choose an outfit. But before that, Lady Duan came to see her, wanting to check if Lara had any money. The heroine pulled a wad of cash from her bag, after which the girls felt they had worried for nothing. After all, she was Isidora's daughter. At the dress shop, the owner was surprised by the sudden visit of Lady Duan and Lady Sweevy. The woman was delighted to see them, and just then, Jimena introduced her to Lara. Seeing her and realizing that she was to design an outfit for Isidora's daughter, the shop owner was almost too shocked to stand. After a whole day of fun and extensive shopping, Lara stood at Damian's door. The heroine didn't understand why she got so nervous every time she was about to see this man. Hearing the invitation to enter, she opened the door, puzzled that he always knew she was coming. Damian thought the reason was that he was always waiting for Lara. Finding this rather vague, she had come because she had a proposition to tell him. Soon, the prince will hold a grand banquet by the river, and the princess will be present. But a mage will try to harm her highness, so Lara wants to bring the hero along as her escort. The princess needs to be saved, and she will surely reward the hero handsomely, as she is young but talented and wise. Damian lowered his head in thought, not understanding why he was being asked to do this. Lara wanted to confess that Sida would soon want to seize and use Damian. To avoid this, it was best to become a benefactor to the princess who happened to be his opponent. And he wouldn't be a discarded and used slave, but a hero admired by all. Lara wanted to answer like this, but she just pretended to say that all mages are bad. Damian became curious, asking if the girl really wanted him to save the princess and destroy evil. Receiving an affirmative answer, the hero silently stared at the floor, pondering everything he had heard. Afterwards, Lara, having secured his agreement, was excited because he hadn't asked too many questions, and he would definitely help. As she left, Damian watched her get into the carriage through the window, certain that this woman knew him. The hero couldn't believe that someone he didn't remember could know him so well. Ordinary people couldn't sense his presence, but beyond that, she could even feel the dangerous aura emanating from Damian. Meanwhile, Lara was very surprised when she learned that he possessed immunity granted by Crown Prince Estragon, which seemed impossible. So, although he had suspected it before, now he was completely sure Lara knew him. Furthermore, the dark mages were already powerful, and to kill a royal, they must have sent their best. However, it didn't matter to Damian, as black magic had absolutely no effect on him. He couldn't understand how Lara knew he could easily defeat the mage, and that the enemy would appear at the banquet. No matter how suspicious he was of her, he couldn't leave this girl. Thus, the hero wondered if there was a situation more absurd than this. Damian had this strange feeling of loss all his life, but when he was with Lara, it disappeared. He kept thinking about her, waiting for her to appear, always listening for footsteps outside the door. He was sure that if his companions knew, they would laugh themselves to death. Not long ago, it was discovered that dark mages had set their sights on the kingdom of Altana. Estragon's heir, knowing these mages had become close to Altana's nobles, wanted to dispatch Damian, who was immune to their magic. Now our hero was completely confused, wondering if Lara knew he was actually a spy sent by Crown Prince Estragon. After some time, on the eve of the banquet, when all the preparations were complete, Eunice and Jimena decided to conduct some serious lessons. Jimena, putting on her glasses and assuming the air of a stern teacher, decided it was time to change Laria's way of speaking. The soft tone had to change. Informal talk and cursing would become Laria's new standard. Laria smiled, wondering if she should also start shouting like Eunice. Just then, Lady Duan jumped up, deciding to give Laria a masterclass. She believed that cursing should have a sharp intonation and tone, and facial expressions should look fierce and serious, yet still natural. However, Jimena believed that facial expressions were more important than the way of speaking. Laria was calm and able to ignore others, but that was too elegant and cold-blooded. She needed to look down on others, disregard them, mock them, and despise them. According to Eunice, Laria should be ready to grab the enemy's hair and make them cry. The next day, our heroine went to pick up Damian. He came out in formal attire, while Laria herself wore a blood-red dress. The dress had a high slit and a striking design. Sitting in the carriage, Laria decided to clarify one thing before they set off. Knowing that people at the banquet would whisper and stare, she wanted the hero to ignore it all. Despite bringing a bodyguard being against etiquette, she decided to use her father's recent attempt to kidnap her as an excuse. Even if they weren't allowed in, the most important thing was for Damian to be near the princess and save her if needed. Arriving at the event, Laria noticed the royals hadn't appeared yet. As they walked towards the banquet, a wave of sarcastic and scornful glances fell upon our protagonist. Laria hadn't expected to attract so much attention, thinking her actions were trivial to seasoned nobles. And now, despite every move being scrutinized, she decided to remain calm and natural. Just then, Damian gently took her hand, bringing her back to reality. In the past, she had to lower her eyes and avoid eye contact, like a herbivore that wouldn't fight. Laria was taught to tuck her tail and lower her head. But she wouldn't do that anymore, deciding to let others judge the new her from now on. She was neither a drinker and curser like Eunice, nor a commotion causer like Jimena. The protagonist walked towards her father, deciding it was time to go her own way. Recalling the feeling of her insides melting when she took the poison, she realized that what was happening now was nothing in comparison. Walking towards the marquee, Laria hoped he would stop begging her mother for alimony. She had heard he was on the verge of bankruptcy, which, in her opinion, was pathetic. At this moment, her father gritted his teeth, but the protagonist remained calm, knowing he would never yell or hit her in front of other nobles. Instead, the marquis wanted his daughter to come home, as it felt so empty without her. But the girl decided it was best not to say things he didn't want to hear. She started to loudly recall how her father not only hit her and locked her in her room, but also tried to kidnap her. Hearing these words and seeing the other guests whispering, the marquis became nervous, thinking his daughter must be joking. Laria didn't care, but how long was he going to pretend he knew nothing? Unable to tolerate such impudence, the marquis ordered her to shut up, raising his hand to hit her. At this moment, everyone in the room looked at him, causing his hand to freeze mid-air, his face twitching with fear. The father pretended to cough, covering his mouth, and looked at his daughter in bewilderment. Laria smiled back, wondering if he was really going to hit her again. The marquis's face darkened with shame and anger as he bit his nails, thinking how much the protagonist resembled her mother. Laria smiled sincerely, thanking God for being compared to her mother. Meanwhile, the sound of trumpets echoed through the hall, announcing the arrival of the royal family. As everyone joyfully greeted their highnesses, Damian and Laria stepped onto the balcony. The hero found it strange that he had to save the princess from so far away, but the girl preferred to avoid Sida. Damian was shocked when he heard that Laria's father had tried to marry her off to the prince, and that meeting him would cause trouble. Our hero thought that becoming a princess wasn't so bad, as it also meant becoming the future queen, but Laria disagreed. So Damian decided to find out exactly where the dark mage who was supposedly going to attack the princess would appear. He guessed the enemy might be hiding on one of the boats floating on the river, but the protagonist wasn't sure. Damian looked thoughtfully at Laria, realizing she was certain the incident would happen, but didn't know the specifics. Seeing the hero unarmed, the girl started to worry a little about whether he could handle it. Damian smiled, thinking she was imagining him failing, but that wasn't the case. After kissing Laria's hand, Damian wondered if she wanted him to be the hero who saved the princess and defeated evil. With her agreement, he suddenly pushed her, promising to catch up later. A completely bewildered Laria accidentally bumped into the princess, and they both fell to the ground. Just then, they heard Damian's voice ordering them to stay still. He covered the girls with his cloak and turned to face the giant magic circle floating in the sky. Feeling the powerful aura, Laria realized that in her past life, all of the princess's knights had died, unable to defeat the enemy. Meanwhile, Damian snatched a shield from a nearby knight, leaving the knight bewildered. He raised the shield and calmly blocked the deadly magic beam shot from the pentagram. The shield shattered instantly, but successfully dispersed the force of the attack. Our hero spotted the caster, turned to the startled warrior, and decided to retreat for the moment, entrusting the lives of his lady and the princess to him. Before the soldier could comprehend these words, the hero's heels shimmered with light as he jumped directly onto the boat hiding the mage, quickly subdued him, and began talking about something. Laria peeked from the balcony and saw the hero calmly tying up the assassin, completely thrilled. But the protagonist still couldn't help but wonder if anyone else had been injured in the first attack. Suddenly, she heard the princess's voice. The princess believed everyone else was fine, and her highness was curious if Miss Bailey was all right. The protagonist was fine, which was much better than the princess and her knights. Laria held her highness's cold hand and decided they should move to a safer place. Satisfied with this, her highness turned to the crowd, ready to give instructions. The injured needed immediate treatment, and Miss Bailey and her knight could join her. In the princess's following room, Laria realized she was also scared, but at least she finally saw the princess's true self. Later, in the princess's chambers, her highness regretted letting the girl get involved in all of this. The princess was sure the young lady should have left when she first noticed the danger, but in the end, it was Laria and her knight who saved her. The protagonist really wished her highness would stop calling her Miss Bailey and just use her name. Meanwhile, their conversation was interrupted by an approaching maid, and the princess didn't understand why she looked so flustered. Suddenly, Damian's imposing figure appeared behind the maid, who timidly introduced him to her highness. Sonia Otana was a sweet and beautiful princess, and the rumors about her kindness and love for her family seemed endless. When the young maids made mistakes, her highness would give them sweets and even built separate quarters for the knights. There were also many stories about her kindness, wisdom, and benevolence, all of which seemed a little too exaggerated. Laria also thought these stories were quite inflated, but now she realized that Sonnet truly was that kind of person. In response to the princess's gratitude, Damian said he was merely protecting his master. Sonnet knew the king would reward them regardless, but she also wanted to personally fulfill the hero's wishes. But the hero believed that if his master desired something, then that was his wish, so he decided to give the reward to her. Realizing the reward should have been his, Laria was completely bewildered, not knowing what to say. Later, as she settled into the carriage, she wondered why Damian had done that. After all, a royal reward always exceeded expectations. He could have easily gained a noble title, or a royal sword, but he didn't need it. Then she thought, this might also make people think more highly of him. Hearing him refuse again, Laria cursed inwardly, feeling like she was talking to a wall. However, the most important thing for the protagonist was that neither the princess nor her knights were injured. In her past life, Laria actually sympathized with the so-called pitiful prince who had to exile her highness. Of course, she hadn't fully atoned yet, but it felt good to make even a small amount of amends. Stretching, she thought it wasn't a big deal that Damian hadn't become a hero. There would be plenty of opportunities later. It turned out he pushed her towards the princess because it was Laria who tried to save the princess, not him. Laria was curious about what the hero had discussed with the dark mage on the ship. When Damian had him by the throat, the mage tried to kill himself, and the hero said something to him at that moment. It turned out Damian was curious about his purpose, and the girl wanted to know too. Hearing that their goal was chaos, Laria thought it was too cliché and obvious. The protagonist decided that even if she couldn't give Damian a title, she would definitely give him that famous sword. Laria yawned widely, thinking that today had been tiring and stressful. Then her eyes closed, and the hero placed her on the seat, covering her with a white cloth, wishing the young lady sweet dreams. Meanwhile, the entire Isadora estate was in an uproar, with the lady herself, Sebastian, and Connie desperately planning their next move. What happened at the banquet spread quickly, and Isadora was frantic, not knowing her daughter's fate. Suddenly, Laria's carriage stopped, and Damian carried the protagonist out of the vehicle. Everyone thought something had happened to the young lady, and were relieved to learn she had simply fallen asleep. The hero carefully handed Laria over to Sebastian, who quickly carried her to her room. The woman, finally meeting Damian in person, immediately invited him to follow her. Looking at her trembling hands, the hero thought that even Isadora Celestial had a vulnerable side. Later, in the drawing room, the woman recalled that everyone considered Damian to be a very talented individual. Learning that he had been a military slave in the Estragon Empire, Isadora decided to find out why he had come to Otana. Until now, the hero had been unwilling to speak with anyone, the Estragon heir having ordered him to remain silent. But now everything had changed. He confessed that they had been tracking a dark mage faction, which greatly surprised the woman. Currently, Damian was investigating the plans and objectives of the dark mages hiding in this kingdom. Learning that the hero didn't belong to any temple, Isadora wanted to find out who his client was. However, Damian flatly refused to answer this question. Isadora was somewhat bothered by the fact that she hadn't been able to uncover anything about his past. The woman wanted to eliminate all the dangers surrounding her daughter, and, considering the hero's activities, thought it best for him to leave. To this, Damian simply expressed his understanding, followed by a brief pause. The woman wanted to make it clear that for Laria, she was prepared to lose everything, even her life, or to overthrow the empire. As for this hero, he would protect Laria at all costs if she were in danger, regardless of the mission. Isadora decided to confirm if this would still hold true if Damian had to betray his client, and received an affirmative answer. After a moment of silence and contemplation, she decided to trust this man. The hero also promised to do his best, after which the Marchioness dismissed him to rest. However, remembering the dark mage talking about killing the Saintess, Damian decided to verify some things. Arriving at the wall, our hero couldn't figure out which Saintess they were talking about. It had been over 100 years since the gods left this land. He jumped through the window into the interrogation room, convinced it was all nonsense, but decided to investigate nonetheless. The dark mage who attacked the princess was knocked unconscious and tied with leather straps to a chair in the middle of the room. He suddenly woke up and almost screamed, but Damian quickly covered his mouth with his hand. Damian suggested he be quiet, or he would suffer cruel torture. First, Damian wanted to know how this guy got the news about the Saintess descending to the mortal world. The mage laughed loudly and shouted that it was the devil's order to kill all women suspected of being the Saintess. Damian held a knife to his throat to keep him quiet, learning that Sonia was an important target. Suddenly, the hero heard footsteps outside the door and quickly covered the prisoner's mouth. At this moment, he had to make a choice: save the mage's life or kill him. The devil's minions could not be redeemed, for they had already offered their lives and souls when they made a deal with the devil. Realizing that a living mage would be useless at best and cause more trouble at worst, Damian quickly delivered a fatal blow with his dagger. Returning to the window, he pondered the plan he had heard about killing all suspected Saintesses. Taking one last look at the mage's corpse before leaving, the hero was sure there was no point in keeping him alive. The next day, Laria tore up the letter from her father asking her to come home to discuss matters. She was choosing her clothes for the day with Connie. After Eunice and Jimena chose a beautiful dress, she suddenly decided to add something to it, making everyone around her curious. Seeing the translucent fabric inside, the girls thought it was a nightgown, but it was actually something else. Laria couldn't remember exactly how many years later it was, but a trend that started in the Empire would sweep through the high society of Otana. Imperial dancers who came to the kingdom wore cloaks made of this fabric, winning the hearts of noble women. She had wanted to wear it when she pretended to be the Saintess, but she didn't have the courage then. At that time, she felt that the Saintess shouldn't wear such a thing, but now she couldn't understand why she had that thought. She excitedly draped the fabric over her bright yellow dress and twirled around, mesmerizing her stunned friends. Connie was deeply moved, because previously the young lady had dressed like a curtain ghost, but now she was wearing clothes that truly suited her. Curious about this ghost, Laria learned that he lived behind the curtains in the room. The mistress had repeatedly asked the maid to stop reading strange books, but this time she discovered it was Sebastian who had lent it to her. Just then, the secretary knocked and entered, saying he needed to speak with the young lady. Laria apologized for always interrupting his important work, but Sebastian believed the girl's safety was paramount. Temporarily forgetting the matter, the mistress introduced her visiting friends, Miss Duane and Miss Sweevy. The ladies were a little surprised by the sudden situation, then greeted the secretary. It turned out that the main reason he came was to talk to Laria, but Sebastian hoped to speak privately. After giving the girls some time to themselves, he and the secretary left the room and went outside. Sebastian suddenly began to say that Damian had just returned to the arena, but would soon be back at the mansion. Our mistress was completely shocked to hear her mother's secretary say such unexpected words. It turned out they planned to have him temporarily stay in a separate building. Laria was completely bewildered when she heard that the hero would become her personal guard. They needed to sign a contract as soon as possible, as others were interested in Damian's abilities. However, there was one issue they couldn't agree on, as the young man was very stubborn. Negotiations stalled on the high salary Isadora wanted to offer, which the hero flatly refused. Like everyone else, Laria was shocked that Damian didn't need any money. That was all the information Sebastian wanted to share, and he thanked the young lady for her time. But she decided to reveal some inside information about her father's corruption so that her mother could easily divorce him. For years, the Marquis had been supplying the temple with drugs made by dark mages and banned in many countries. They needed to catch him as soon as possible, as the entire kingdom was in chaos because of the dark mage. Sebastian was shocked to hear this news, wondering first how Laria had learned all this. Realizing it was best not to talk about her past life, Laria pretended that she had simply been observing her father secretly and found his dealings with the temple suspicious. With her father, the prince, and the temple so closely connected, it wouldn't have been difficult for them to fabricate a saintess. Sebastian was overwhelmed by the news, and it turned out Isadora had known all along. But since the Marquis was Laria's father, she tried not to interfere. Isadora realized that the Marquis's mistakes could drag Laria down with him, and remained silent to prioritize her daughter. Realizing she had become a stumbling block again, the young woman felt incredibly bitter. Laria wondered what Sebastian thought she could do in this situation. It turned out he was certain that Laria's opinion mattered most, and that her mother would definitely listen to her. The reason was that Isadora intended for Laria to become the next Marchioness. While everything could be resolved with a simple divorce, if the Marquis of Bailey were completely ruined, it would be difficult for Laria to inherit the title. Laria was bewildered by the information, admitting that she didn't want to become the Marquis of Bailey at all. The young woman wanted nothing to do with the place, much to Sebastian's surprise. He smiled and said that, in that case, he would try to persuade the Marchioness. That evening, Laria went to the arena with Eunice and Jimena. Upon learning that there was a mage in the capital distributing drugs, Laria wanted to confirm with her friends if they knew about it. Miss Duane, who was applying lipstick, was so startled by the question that she smeared it on her cheek. The girls immediately shrieked, saying that while they weren't angels, dealing with a dark mage was too much, and Laria shouldn't get involved. However, Laria just wanted to ask if they had perhaps heard anything, and if not, she was prepared to handle it herself. Suddenly, Jimena remembered something she had heard recently, which terrified Eunice. It was just some drug dealing under the bridge by dark mages. Although expensive, men and women only needed a sip to have an unforgettable night. Suddenly, Laria and Eunice looked at Jimena with suspicion. This left her bewildered. Laria couldn't help but laugh, while Miss Sweevy defended herself, saying she could manage without such things if she wanted to. Upon arriving at their destination, the girls confirmed that Laria was indeed going to see Damian. Eunice suddenly blushed, thinking that Laria's mother's secretary was a really good person. She knew Laria might find those words obvious, as few people actually respected girls, mostly saying harsh things or simply ignoring them. After that, Jimena also blushed, and the scene became awkward. Miss Sweevy grabbed Miss Duane's shoulder, not understanding why she had said those things. They didn't let Laria get a word in before running off, red as tomatoes, wishing her a good time with the hero. Laria sighed affectionately, fully aware of how shy and kind they were, while the most saintly of all was Damian, who for some reason refused to accept the money offered. It turned out the hero didn't want to just take the money, especially such a large sum, as protecting Laria wasn't his job. Learning that he didn't consider it his job, Laria decided to clarify, only to be surprised to find out that it was, in fact, his specialty. He was meant to be with her for 6 months anyway, but taking money from her mother meant a double contract. Laria didn't understand how that would change their relationship, and then Damian smiled mysteriously. As he moved closer to Laria, he wondered what their current relationship was. Flustered by the question, the young woman admitted she wanted to go buy drugs with him. Under the bridge, the hero was surprised, wondering if they really needed it. This made Laria blush even more. There was a bar by the city river frequented by nobles, and that's where they were headed. Determined to protect Damian at all costs, Laria invited him on a date, although her motives were different. Connie, realizing how much this resembled a real date, couldn't hide her surprise. The maid was curious if Laria had been enjoying such thrills too often lately. Laria didn't understand why the maid had tagged along, and it turned out Connie didn't want her to be alone with a man. Laria thought she was being too stubborn, while Damian just chuckled softly, thinking the maid had misunderstood. Meanwhile, Laria suspected that under the guise of the love potion, there might be something dangerous. Suddenly, Connie waved to everyone, pointing to the person they were looking for. Looking at the carriage parked to the side, the maid wondered if Laria really intended to go there. However, Laria decided to just look around and return unnoticed. Just as she was about to open the door, a hooded face appeared in the window, staring directly at her. Damian immediately readied his sword, which confused the already startled Laria even more, but suddenly the stranger wanted to know how much the young lady was willing to pay. Realizing he took her for a buyer, Laria, smiling, decided to offer 300. Hearing the price, the stranger realized it was like an auction. Suddenly, the stranger handed Laria a bag of drugs as a prepayment. Damian and Laria immediately decided to check the contents of the pouch. Seeing the exact same bottle as the poison she drank to commit suicide in her past life, Laria panicked. Losing control, she suddenly opened the carriage door. To everyone's shock, as she lunged at the unknown merchant, Damian managed to grab her, but Laria still caught the edge of his cloak. This confused the stranger. In her past life, this person couldn't believe a Sanus would come to him for something like this. But Laria, thinking it was just a safety precaution, wanted to complete the transaction quickly. The alchemist, whose name was Valentine, satisfied with the money he received, immediately handed the goods to Miss Bailey. It was he who made the poison that killed Laria. In her past life, now as she grabbed him, the alchemist immediately started making excuses that it wasn't a fraud at all, but the girl just decided to pay double if he brought another bottle tomorrow at the same time. After agreeing, he ran away in fear, disappearing behind the shadows of the buildings. Pulling Laria back into the carriage, Damian and Connie worried that she would catch a cold. It was pouring rain outside, soaking Laria's hair, and the maid immediately started drying it for her. Laria understood that Valentine must be suffering harsh treatment from his mentor right now. The dark mage, in her past life, unable to endure the insults and death threats from his teacher, asked Miss Bailey for help. The alchemist revealed to Laria the whole truth about his mentor's drug dealings with Valentine's father. Valentine hoped the girl would help him, but she considered it a lie, as she believed her people were devout. After that, the alchemist, following in his mentor's footsteps, started making drugs and poisons, as it was the only thing he knew how to do. Perhaps if Laria had helped him then, Valentine wouldn't have ended up doing what his hated teacher did. But now Laria had the power to help him, so she sent Damian to keep an eye on Valentine. It turned out that back then, the alchemist was just a middleman and had recently been beaten. Everything was as Laria suspected, so now she was determined to help him. The next day, as agreed, Valentine hurried to their carriage, hoping to receive double payment, but just as he approached the carriage door, it suddenly opened and Damian quickly grabbed Valentine. Throwing him inside, crashing him against the opposite wall, the alchemist screamed in pain. Damian wondered if he should gag him, but Laria decided against it, ordering the carriage to move. The trembling Valentine couldn't understand who they were or why they were doing this. It turned out that Laria had done a little research on the product he sold the day before. The drug was made by an apprentice of a dark mage, so before handing him over to the guards, she wanted to have chat. Valentine turned pale with fright, stammering excuses that he knew nothing about any dark mages. But realizing that the girl knew everything, he confessed to doing it for the money, because his younger brothers were starving at home. Laria guessed that before the dark mage took him in, the alchemist was a vagrant. However, due to his lack of talent in dark magic, he couldn't even make a contract with a weak demon, so he was forced into this line of work. After that, Valentine started shouting frantically, not understanding why they were asking if they already knew everything. He he still didn't understand who they were, and the girl introduced herself as his employer, but the alchemist immediately refused, as she had just threatened him and was going to hand him over to the guards. Hearing that Lara would deal with his teacher, Valentine immediately fell silent, looking at her suspiciously. Lara wanted him to expose all of his menor's crimes, and in return, she would ensure the alchemist changed his profession. Furthermore, Lara believed that Valentine would be killed or abandoned sooner or later, so why refuse a helping hand? Hearing her words, the alchemist's face froze in surprise, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. But coming back to reality, he remembered that no one helps without a reason, so he didn't believe the girl. Then she suggested they go to the guards, at which point Valentine got angry, wondering how a noble lady could know the hardships of the streets. Lara stared thoughtfully at the ceiling, remembering that her mother was the world-renowned Isadora. She was curious about what the boy wanted to do most after getting away from his mentor. Lara was pleased to hear that his dream was to run his own business, as she happened to know a merchant who could help him. Moreover, he would be running the business under her protection. Hearing this, Valentine looked at her as if she were an angel. As he shook her hand, he warned her that his mentor was truly terrifying. Lara glanced at Damian, unconcerned, as her guard was even more terrifying. Finally reaching an agreement with the alchemist, Lara thanked heaven that everything had gone so smoothly. Damian, watching her, realized that he was doing all of this simply because Lara wanted it. To the hero, it seemed as if she had known what decision this man would make from the very beginning. The more he watched, the more curious he became, wondering what her next plan would be. Later, when Sebastian told Isadora that Lara had found a dark mage, she was bewildered. She also didn't understand how her daughter had discovered that this could help resolve the divorce issue. The secretary also found her unusual, as they themselves had only just discovered this matter, yet Lara already knew. Isadora decided that if she reported it to the temple and handled other matters discreetly, no one would get hurt. However, Sebastian knew this was impossible, as the temple had long been colluding with the Marchioness. The Marchioness didn't know what to make of her daughter, and the secretary thought she was worrying too much. Besides, only Isadora still treated Lara like a child, even though she was already an adult. But no matter what, the Marchioness refused to acknowledge this. She always believed that Lara was still a child. Sebastian understood this, but everything this young lady said and did stemmed from sincere love for her mother. Otherwise, how could she have found the dark mage's hideout so quickly? This worried Isadora greatly, because before she crossed the threshold of the manor and left, everything was different. Lara had been a gentle and affectionate child, crying and screaming at her coming-of-age ceremony, unwilling to see her mother. Now Isadora was completely bewildered by such a drastic change in her daughter's behavior. Furthermore, the Marchioness ordered Damian to join her mercenaries in attacking the dark mage and capturing him alive. She also decided to contact the security forces and officially report the case. Having received his instructions, the secretary hurried to his office and had the maid invite the hero over. A while later, Lara, standing before Damian, was surprised that things were progressing so quickly. The hero decided to resolve the dark mage issue for Lara, but he wanted an answer to a question. However, Damian wanted Lara to be completely honest. He wouldn't accept any lies or silence. Lara found this strange, and although she didn't understand what was going on, she agreed to tell him the truth. Meanwhile, Isadora's mercenary squad, calling themselves the Wolf Pack, waited patiently for the hero. One of them felt it was a pity that their mistress was wasting money on them. The other members were also glad to finally have a chance to earn Isadora's reward through action. However, it was unclear why so many people were needed to capture one person, and with another person accompanying them. But they couldn't let their guard down, as dark mages were not simple, and the mistress assured them that their new ally was very capable. Hearing footsteps nearby, the squad quickly turned around, all eyes focused on the approaching Damian. One girl, finding him adept at speed, suggested he lead the group. He agreed, quickly mounting his horse and beckoning his new companions to follow. As they neared their destination, They dismounted and began to stealthily make their way down the narrow alleyways. Reaching the entrance to the dark mage's lair, Damian signaled his companions to halt. The hero leaned against the building's wall, pointing to a wooden plank that served as the entrance. Seeing him pull the heavy plank from the wall with such ease, the mercenaries were amazed by his strength. They wanted to follow him inside, but Damian decided to enter alone, leaving them on the street. After he left, the warriors sat outside for 5 minutes and began to truly worry about the hero. After all, 5 minutes was enough time to be killed. Then, the oldest among them decided to take the initiative and walk towards the entrance. Starting from a hole in the wall, a spiral staircase descended downwards. Suddenly, faint footsteps echoed from below. Realizing someone was coming up, the mercenaries drew their swords and waited nervously. Seconds later, seeing the source of the footsteps, they almost screamed in fright. A vaguely human-like body slowly floated up the stairs, its skin pale and its clothes stained with blood. The mercenaries, thinking a dark mage was attacking, prepared to strike first. Suddenly, a hand emerged from the darkness, holding the mage's corpse. Following close behind was Damian himself. The mercenaries were dumbfounded and bewildered, thinking this hero was a madman. Who would walk around carrying a corpse like that? Damian simply didn't know what would happen if he transported the body any other way. The mercenaries were amazed he'd killed the dark mage single-handedly, but the truth was the woman had committed suicide. The hero had barely descended the stairs when he was attacked with dark magic. Calmly deflecting it with his dagger, he noticed a woman nearby, shrouded in dark energy. She attempted to blow up the hideout. Damian rushed forward to stop her spell, severing her fingers with a single stroke, promising to spare her life if she came with him. But at that moment, the woman drank poison, ending her life, catching Damian off guard. Amidst the chaos, the mercenaries were most surprised by how the hero had even gotten close to the dark mage. Just then, one of them pointed in a direction, drawing his companion's attention. They saw a temple squad, led by Isadora herself, approaching them. A while later, while searching the dark mage's hideout, they uncovered various clues. It turned out the woman had been taking in orphans, teaching them dark magic, and promising them plenty of food. She also brewed potions using demonic magic and sold them to the clergy. After gathering various pieces of evidence of her crimes, Isadora presented them to the king. An investigation into the clergy members who purchased the drugs from the dark mage was launched, turning the entire temple upside down. Marchioness Bailey became extremely worried, even seeking sanctuary within the temple. After questioning the clergy, Prince Sidar, noticing the marquee's restlessness, decided to sever ties with him. He personally reported the marquee's involvement in these affairs to the king, hoping his majesty would severely punish the culprit. It was now necessary to make an example of this and establish loyalty among the nobles. During this time, the marquee himself had lost a lot of weight, sitting in his office and blaming everything on Isadora. He thought she was just a commoner who received a noble title from him and didn't know who made her rich. Sometime later, Lara, along with Eunice and Jimena, were at the studio choosing room decorations. Miss Duan was surprised to see the girl so happy. Something good must have happened. The protagonist responded with a smile, surprised that it was all so obvious. Eunice thought this whole dark mage affair was an unbelievable coincidence. As Lara agreed it was just luck, Jimena asked if she had tried the love potion. According to Miss Sweevy, she should have drunk it with her handsome warrior by now. Lara became embarrassed. Eunice said if she didn't need the potion, she could have it. But the protagonist believed the potion was fake, which made the girls a little upset, considering she had spent 300 gold coins on it. At this point, Jimena wanted to meet the alchemist to ask for a discount, since she was an acquaintance of their employer. This was too much. Laria's face turned as red as a tomato, and she was panting like a steam engine, which made the ladies decide to leave the studio first. She paid for the goods first, asking for them to be delivered to Isadora's estate, and then headed for the exit. As she opened the front door, she thought it was time to get something to eat. But just then, she was horrified to see two men grab her friends and demand that Lara get into a carriage. She agreed to go with them on the condition that they release the girls. Once in the carriage, she heard Eunice and Jimena desperately calling out to her. Realizing there was no escape anyway, Lara demanded they release the ladies immediately. Knowing their fiery tempers, the men struck the girls' necks, knocking them unconscious. She was angry because this wasn't what they promised, but the men figured they were just releasing them. Noticing the kidnapper's attire, Laria realized they were the Marquis's men. Afterward, they blindfolded her and tied her hands. She couldn't feel the bumps at all afterward, as if she weren't in a carriage. When they finally removed her blindfold, she saw the only person she expected to do this, her father. His face was completely devoid of anger. He had lost a lot of weight, looking more like a living skeleton, staring intently at his daughter. The Marquis was happy to see his daughter after so long and wanted to know how she was doing. The protagonist smiled at him, realizing that unlike her, things hadn't been going well for him. Her father was angry at Laria's lack of sympathy for him, but she couldn't understand how she could sympathize with someone who kidnapped his own child. The man, furious that she would utter such filth, punched her in the face. He had already contacted Isadora and just needed to wait for her to accept his proposal, after which the Marquis would release Laria. The girl fiercely defended her mother, which further enraged her father, as he was about to be deported because of this woman. Laria realized that, faced with the threat of deportation, the Marquis was cornered and starting to make reckless decisions. Her father truly wished his daughter possessed the same noble elegance as himself, but somehow she took after her mother. But the girl talked back, saying that if he just wanted to sell his daughter, he should have done it properly from the beginning. She received another blow. The Marquis, convinced that since she was his child, she would help him. Laria retorted that he wasn't the one who gave birth to her, and now that he had no use for her, he was just venting his anger. At that moment, he furiously grabbed a vase of flowers and poured the water over her. Her father believed the relationship between parents and children was ordained by the heavens, but she defied this. Laria looked at him, bewildered, unable to comprehend how the Marquis dared to say such things. After all, did this man really deserve such treatment from his daughter? In her past life, when they learned that the saintess needed to be sacrificed to the demon, Prince Sidar at least pretended to care. The Marquis's influence was entirely maintained by his daughter's image as the saintess. Opposing it would shake his position. It was the Marquis who most actively proposed sacrificing the girl, assuring her it was her family duty. Thus, Laria became the great saintess who sacrificed herself to save the kingdom, and the Marquis became the great father who raised the saintess daughter and supposedly grieved her sacrifice. He must have envisioned this image in his mind from the very beginning, but now our protagonist decided she had no place in it. The Marquis flew into a rage, believing that although her mother birthed her, since Laria had his blood flowing through her veins, she belonged to him. Seeing her chuckle and understanding, the man crossed his arms in satisfaction, thinking she finally got it. The girl suddenly stood up, moved swiftly, and after accelerating, slammed her head against the table with all her might. As blood flowed down the table, Laria decided that if this was the Marquis's filthy blood, it had to be expelled from her body immediately. The Marquis, watching his daughter, was truly frightened, not understanding how a person could become so violent. The girl, with a sinister smile, started laughing maniacally, blood steadily flowing from the wound on her forehead, satisfied as she watched her father's horrified expression. She thought, he made her this way. Meanwhile, Isadora stood before the bed where Eunice and Jimena lay, fearfully reading her daughter's ransom note. Sebastian tried to comfort her, but she realized with a shock that even if they paid the ransom, the Marquis wouldn't easily release Laria. She demanded her secretary immediately contact the Royal Guard Knights and inform them of the situation. Furthermore, she ordered the hired wolf mercenaries to head to Marquis Damian's mansion. She demanded they protect her daughter at all costs, even if it meant killing everyone. Later, Laria lay in bed, contemplating how to escape now that all the windows and doors were sealed. Staring at the burning candle, she recalled the story Connie told about the ghost that lived behind the curtains and would harm sleeping people at night. However, this ghost was afraid of firelight, which was why people had to sleep with the lights on. Now our protagonist wished she could take back her words, telling the maid to stop reading strange books. Her father had locked her up and starved her, believing that sooner or later she would beg for mercy. He decided he would let her go then, but for now, Laria was a bargaining chip and needed to be kept quiet. Seeing him untie her hands, because Laria had bled, made it clear how little she meant to him. With these thoughts, she abruptly ripped down the curtains in the room and looked out the window with a smile. Afterward, she rushed to the wardrobe and began pulling everything out and throwing it on the floor. Now everything was ready, but she still needed something to barricade the door. Looking around, Laria's gaze fell once more on the tall lamp in the corner of the room. Meanwhile, at her bedroom door, the guards were sitting, sharing wine, and chatting merrily. Hearing the rustling inside the room, they just scoffed at the girl's pathetic. Laria barricaded the door with a floor lamp and attempted to escape. Holding the burning lamp, she realized the foolish guards could have prevented all of this. Now, with everything ready, she began to spread the fire around the room, igniting clothes and curtains. Sitting in the bathtub full of water, Laria suddenly heard screams from outside the door, demanding she open it immediately. Although she did this to make them think she wanted to die, Laria wasn't sure she would survive. Thinking about all the things she still had left to do, Laria suddenly felt a strange movement in the water behind her. At that moment, she became confused, frantically touching her head. The pain from a wound on her forehead suddenly disappeared, as if it had never existed. Walking to the mirror, she was surprised to find the skin on her forehead smooth and flawless, as if it had never been injured. This could only be called a miracle. Completely bewildered, the girl stared at her reflection in the mirror. At that moment, she saw through the window that the fire had spread throughout the building. The mansion was slowly collapsing, opening a path for her escape. Laria grabbed her cloak from the water, realizing that if she didn't escape now, it would be too late. But opening the door was absolutely out of the question, because if they discovered her wound had completely healed, they might take advantage of it. Walking to the window and watching the raging fire consume the collapsing remains of the mansion, Laria felt a surge of fear. Now, if a miracle were to happen, it could only be after she jumped. But the question that kept her hesitating in the room was, would a miracle really happen? Just then, she heard the Marquis's desperate cries from behind the door, begging her to open it. After a running start, she jumped out the window, deciding that even if a miracle didn't happen, she had to get through the flames, the fall, and even her father. Not long before, a group of wolf mercenaries, led by Damian, were rushing towards the Marquis's mansion at full speed. The huge fire burning within the building could be seen from afar, and the hero was shocked at the sight. Damian rounded a corner to shorten the distance, ordering his squad to increase their speed. Approaching the mansion fence, he jumped from his running horse onto the fence, carefully observing the estate. He realized the burning room was Laria's, as she was perfectly capable of doing such a thing. Deciding to head in that direction, he cut through the trees and quickly arrived at the correct window. Just then, he saw Laria take a running start, crash through the window with her body, and begin to fall. Damian immediately rushed forward, causing the soot-covered girl to be bewildered by his sudden appearance. She desperately reached out to her rescuer. The hero also reached out, desperately trying to grab her. Once he caught her, he twisted his body so that Laria was on top, and a second later they hit the ground. Damian landed on his back, absorbing the full impact, while Laria landed right on top of him, pinning him underneath. The unharmed girl began to shake the hero, hoping he would wake up. But Damian lay there with his eyes closed, completely unresponsive to Laria's movements. Suddenly, he opened his eyes, indicating he was completely fine, and gently stroked Laria's hair, fighting back tears of gratitude. The girl realized that thanks to him, she was safe. Damian hugged Laria tightly, deciding that now he had to kill her father. At that moment, the wolf mercenaries arrived, admitting they nearly wet themselves when they saw the two of them jump from afar. Suddenly, the Marquis's angry shouts rang out, berating his men for letting his daughter escape. This further enraged Damian, but Laria thought it best to leave quickly. However, the wolf mercenaries knew there was nothing to worry about, as Isadora herself had arrived. The mercenaries seized the Marquis, and as they approached, a woman slapped him hard across the face. The man couldn't believe she dared to hit him, but Isadora delivered another resounding slap. At this point, Laria rushed to hug her mother, who immediately asked if her daughter was all right. Laria assured her that everything was fine, but immediately fell silent after seeing her mother's expression. The woman's face reflected the unimaginable pain she saw in her daughter's eyes. But now everything was all right, though the girl had truly missed her. Clinging tightly to Isadora, Laria was afraid she would never see her mother again. Turning to the Marquis, the woman gave him a sharp, hawk-like look. Hearing that he was no longer this child's father, nor her husband, the man was stunned. Just as he was about to retort, he saw the royal guard approaching and stopped mid-sentence. As they read the indictment bearing the royal signature, he tried to break free from the guard's grip, but suddenly the mercenaries released him, tripping him and causing the Marquis to fall to the ground. The royal guard captain held the royal decree in front of the marquis's face, ordering his immediate arrest. At this moment, Isadora and Laria looked at the man with contempt, hoping he would die alone and in agony in his cell. Sometime later, Laria learned some shocking news about the Marquis from Sebastian. Her mother had not only successfully divorced him, but also requested that their names, mother and daughter, be removed from the Bailey family registry. However, after careful consideration and weighing the pros and cons, the king decided to grant only half the request. He erased their names from the family registry, but if Laria ever wanted to lead the family in the future, or if her husband needed the title, they could use the Bailey surname. As for the Marquis, the king stripped him of his surname and title, deciding to exile him. Having lost his status, property, family, and even his name, the man could no longer exercise any power under the Bailey name. Overjoyed by these events, Laria understood that the whole of society was now in an uproar. A few days later, after resting at Isadora's estate, Eunice and Jimena finally went to the arena with Laria. Although they were Laria's friends, she still felt they were taking advantage of her being a patient and ordering her around as they pleased. Mrs. Sweevy, watching Laria, thought that although they were going out for drinks, the youngest one might go to see her boyfriend. Laria didn't understand why she was being called the youngest one, and later learned that Jimena was the older sister, as she was the first to set fire to their father's house. Jimena hugged her tightly, praising her little sister for a job well done. Laria wished them a good time, and then went to find Damian, who was probably packing his things by now. She was glad he finally agreed to move in with them, despite being so stubborn before. More importantly, Sida had given Laria a royal sword discovered by explorers in some unknown cave. This was the sword the current king received upon his ascension to the throne, and it was now to be passed on to Damian. The royal sword could only be gifted with the king's permission, and if a hero received such a historical sword, the gift was highly significant. Laria, full of hope that Damian would be happy to receive such a gift, knocked on his door. However, no one answered. She stood at the door for a few minutes, knocking persistently, but there was no response. This was strange, as usually the hero would open the door before she even knocked. So, she decided to go inside and check. Despite Damian's promise to pack and move, his room was empty. Meanwhile, our hero arrived at a shabby little shop in a back alley of the city. Inside the shop, a bearded fellow was peeling potatoes. Seeing our hero, he figured he must have been popular lately. Knowing Damian wasn't one for fame, the fellow couldn't figure out why he was so popular, but the hero figured it wasn't his business to worry about. Sighing at Damian's continued silence, the old man opened a secret trapdoor in the floor and let the hero in. He triggered a magic beam that shot down into the basement, lighting a lamp inside a chest. Damian approached the lamp and heard the voice of a sir, who was thrilled to finally be able to get in touch with the hero. The voice was annoyed that Damian had only decided to contact him now, especially since he already had almost all the information. Moreover, he wanted the hero to stop calling him by his name and instead use his title, the Crown Prince of Estragon. However, since Damian was his friend and savior, Assur was prepared to forgive his ignorance for the 81st time. Relieved, the hero reported to the prince that the dark mages were looking for the saint. The temple was quiet, but it seemed the devils had made the first move, and the dark mages had begun their search. To this, Damian only heard that they were all crazy, which made him curious about the next instructions. Assur wanted to figure everything out himself, but for now, he ordered the hero to find the saint before the dark mages, as the battle with the devils was coming. Meanwhile, Laria, sitting in Damian's room, picked up a knife and cut her finger. Seeing the wound heal instantly, Laria thought this couldn't be possible. Without waiting for the hero to return, Laria went straight home to her own room. She placed a bottle of wine in front of her and began repeatedly cutting her finger, watching the wound heal as she drank. Despite the alcohol, her mind remained unusually clear. Laria was convinced this wasn't a hallucination. The most likely scenario was that she was already dead, unable to die before the appointed day. Laria wondered if she would die at that moment 10 years from now, and if she could atone for her sins before her death. She stepped onto the balcony for some fresh air, recalling the scene of falling when Damian caught her without hesitation. The hero didn't even know Laria that well, as he had no memories of his past life. So why did he try so hard? Looking down, she unexpectedly saw a light on in Damian's room. Lara hurried over with a portable lamp, hoping to see him. Peeking into the room, she saw Damian shirtless, looking at her in surprise. Blushing with embarrassment, she apologized for the sudden visit, confessing that she had recently been to the arena but hadn't found him. Lara didn't quite understand why she was so embarrassed. She also wanted to give him the royal sword gifted by Prince Sidar. Damian also decided to apologize, as she must have been disappointed not to see him when she visited, but it turned out the young woman wasn't disappointed. However, it felt a little strange. First, Damian invited Lara into his room and offered her a seat on the sofa. Lara felt somewhat guilty for Damian's fall from a high place while trying to save her. He must have been hurt badly. Damian sat beside her, dismissing it as nothing since he was her knight. Looking into his eyes, Lara thought that if they hadn't met at the arena back then, they wouldn't be sitting here like this now. A distinguished hero like him could go anywhere even without a master, so she had always wondered why he kissed her back then. After all, although she knew him, it should have been the first time Damian had seen her. Hearing this, the hero's eyes widened, hoping she would repeat herself. Realizing what she had blurted out, Lara was horrified, feeling she had made a mistake. She hurriedly tried to leave, suggesting Damian pretend he hadn't heard anything. The hero grabbed her hand, reminding her of her promise. This completely stunned the young woman. He remembered her promise to answer his questions honestly if he defeated the Dark Mage. Now Damian's only question was what else she knew about him. After all, she had recognized him from the very beginning, even though they had never met before. Moreover, watching how everything unfolded, he realized Lara seemed to be able to foresee the future, but that wasn't the case. The young woman humbly lowered her head, admitting it wasn't foresight at all, after which the hero had her sit back down on the sofa. First, Lara wanted to know if Damian could believe her if she confessed everything. Stroking her cheek, the Duke honestly said he would try to believe her. Then she confessed that their relationship was completely different because this was her second life. A long time ago, in her previous life, she had betrayed and used the hero. Not only that, but she had also sent Damian to the battlefield to be killed by countless people. Back then, Lara was madly infatuated with Prince Sidar, his puppet, doing everything according to his will. She still didn't know why, but in her past life, Damian always came back to her. Only now did she realize that even back then, she only felt comfortable when she was with the hero. In her past life, Lara was a sinner, framing innocent people for her own benefit and even trying to make Damian a target of the Empire. One day, as this continued to repeat, the hero finally wanted to know why she hated him. Although it was too late now, at least now Lara wanted to confess that she had never hated him. On the contrary, she was attracted to Damian, and now she had the courage to say it out loud. However, in her past life, he left Otana forever without ever getting her answer. After saying these words, Lara smiled, and the hero decided she didn't have to continue if she found it difficult. But she mustered the courage to admit that in the end, she had committed suicide, ending her life. Just as she thought her worthless life was over, Lara opened her eyes and suddenly found herself back in the past. Damian guessed that was why she went straight to him. He thought she might still want to use him, but that wasn't the case. Lara only wanted to correct her past mistakes and apologize to him. Understanding that this conversation might be painful for her, Damian decided to change the subject. He remembered her curiosity about why he had kissed her. The hero did it to have a reason to stay in Otana, as he needed to find the saint. Initially, he was investigating the Dark Mage's movements, but recently received a new mission to find the saint and bring her to the Empire. In other words, Damian was here on a mission, so he wanted Lara to stop with the absurd apologies. Lara knew little about the saint, so she decided to go to the temple to gather some information. Realizing that even though she was a fake saint, she had no relevant information, Lara decided to help as much as possible. So she figured everything was fine. Damian could continue to use her for his purposes because this time she wouldn't betray him. Confused by her behavior, the hero wondered if this eased her conscience. Lara had always wanted to apologize to him, so she decided to become his supporter. Damian thought their entire relationship was built on her guilt, unsure what would happen once she was free of it. Lara planned to give him his freedom because, in her past life, Damian became a king. Laria's words sounded like the ramblings of someone who'd just woken from a nightmare. But hearing her speak the truth again, Damian resolved to be there for her, no matter what she wanted or needed. Laria felt the misunderstanding deepen. Not wanting to continue the conversation, Damian grabbed her hand and pulled her down the hallway, urging her to return to her room. Just before the door closed, Laria tried to call out to him, but Damian seemed not to hear. The next day, Laria and Connie visited a temple, hoping to find some records about the saint. Learning that these records were inscribed on tablets 6 through 22, the two girls hurried to examine them. Each slab was several meters high, requiring them to carefully study the text. Laria decided to inspect everything herself, leaving her maid to keep watch outside. This was partly because news of Laria visiting the temple might actually improve her damaged image. Looking at the tablets and recalling Damian's anger, Laria realized everything had happened too abruptly. She should have calmly explained everything, as it was already difficult to believe. And, as she spoke, she'd unconsciously started recalling the past. Those spoken words couldn't be taken back. She still planned to apologize to Damian one day. This time, she simply had to tell the truth. Now aware of his mission, Laria wasn't sure if she should confess to being a false saint. Even if she did, would he believe her now? It was better to focus on what needed to be done, as there was indeed a lot to read. As the sun began to set, Laria finally finished examining the tablets, thanking Connie for her hard work. Connie looked at her mistress with awe, wondering if she had truly read everything. It turned out she had, but the information she found wasn't ideal. Apparently, the saint was the key to summoning the gods, a messenger of the divine. This was why the devil and his dark mages were after her. But the tablets were too old, their contents unreliable, more like a legend than a factual record. Laria hadn't even tried to organize it all, just getting the gist. At least now she knew that under no circumstances could she be the saint. If a god truly existed, the saint couldn't be someone who deceived people, causing them pain while feigning righteousness. If the absolute entity observing the world had given her a second chance, it must have been the devil, not God. Arriving at Isidora's mansion, Laria met Sebastian at the entrance. The secretary inquired about preparing dinner for her, but Laria politely declined, deciding to go straight to her room. Sebastian then handed her a letter addressed to her, personally written by Lady Devon. It turned out Eunice had invited Laria to a party celebrating the end of summer. The catch was, it was an event that required an escort. Connie gasped as she read the last line. If Laria didn't bring a male companion, their friendship was over. Realizing she had no suitable escort, Laria decided to decline. Suddenly, she remembered Valentine, but according to her maid, he was unsuitable, still afraid of Laria. Then she thought of Sebastian, but he was too busy, leaving her back in the predicament of being escortless. Connie learned that Laria and Damian had recently quarreled, so he was temporarily out of the question. A few days later, still unable to find an escort, Laria became desperate and began pleading with Eunice to introduce someone. Lady Devon was shocked that the conflict between Laria and Damian had lasted so long. Connie, standing opposite, recalled hearing that Princess Sonnet might also attend the event. Upon hearing of the princess's potential arrival, Eunice decided to cancel the banquet, much to Laria's surprise. The lady had originally planned for strong alcohol, lively music, and bright lights. But because of the young princess, they couldn't do that, having to switch to non-alcoholic drinks and dainty pastries. Laria then hoped she could attend without an escort, but Eunice refused, saying it would be more fun with one. Lady Devon wondered who the princess would bring. According to Laria, it could be her father, brother, a relative, or even her personal knight. The first three options were immediately dismissed. Since the princess was already 14, she would likely bring a knight. As a bodyguard, after a moment of thought, Laria suddenly decided to ask Connie if she had a men's apron she could wear. As the maid went to find one, Eunice caught on to Laria's plan. Aside from Laria wanting to keep this a secret from Jimena, as it would make things more entertaining, Side flatly refused when his sister invited him to be her escort. Sonnet looked at her brother almost pleadingly, but the prince pretended to be busy with work, asking her to leave his office. She had anticipated his refusal, but the princess couldn't understand why her brother looked at her so coldly. The noble women of the Orton kingdom all adored the prince, and Sonnet had hoped that going with him would earn her their favor. For political reasons, she couldn't bring just anyone, but she also didn't want to bring knights, as they were all her father's age. Her Highness had always wanted to attend such a banquet, where grown women boldly drank strong alcohol and danced. It was a place where, regardless of status, one could get to know anyone as long as their personalities clicked. But most importantly for the princess, she missed Lara and hoped to see her there. Suddenly, she was informed that Laviore Rea Bailey requested an audience, and Sonnet immediately ordered her to be let in. And since the heroine no longer used the Bailey surname, the princess ordered the servants to address her as Lara, daughter of Isadora, from now on. Just then, the door opened, and to her highness's shock, Lara walked in wearing a formal men's suit. The heroine cheerfully greeted the princess, intending to offer her services as an escort to the banquet. Later, watching his sister leave, Silo was bewildered, wondering if she was really going to a place where such indecent people gathered. The prince hoped his sister's maids would encourage Sonnet to do this for a while, as it was the right age for her to have fun. And Side thought that if Sonnet continued to associate with these rough people, it would fit perfectly into his plans. Thinking of Lara, the prince decided that although the count was disgraced because of Isadora's reputation, they could make up for this flaw. He specifically arranged for a carriage to wait at the end of the banquet, acting the part of a caring older brother who would come to pick her up later. Eunice and Jimena, upon seeing the heroine at the banquet, were shocked to discover that Lara had actually done it. The heroine didn't understand who they were referring to, after which the ladies began to apologize to her highness. Suddenly, Lara noticed the princess gazing with intense longing at the dancing guests. She immediately invited Sonnet to dance, but her highness shyly refused at once. The princess didn't want to cause trouble for the girl, but Lara was actually worried about her, considering her own attire, because if they went out to dance, everyone would stare at them, which made Sonnet turn to her in surprise. Lara thought that if her highness was shy in front of her, they could just dance one song. Finally receiving consent, Lara didn't know with what kind of emotions the princess held her hand. As a 14-year-old girl burdened with royal responsibilities, Sonnet couldn't do what she truly wanted. So now, while dancing with the heroine, the young princess was almost brought to tears. Jimena didn't know what to do if Lara stole Sonnet's heart, while Eunice thought the heroine was a true devil. Suddenly, her highness curiously asked if the sword she sent had arrived safely, and after receiving the girl's thanks, the princess made another request. She wanted Lara to visit her regularly at the palace. At that moment, Sonnet's cheeks flushed like peaches, her round eyes full of affection. It would be strange not to know by now that the princess really liked the heroine. Continuing to dance, Lara happily accepted the invitation, considering it an honor. Meanwhile, Damian rushed to negotiate with Asterisk, urgently summoned by the prince. As soon as the lights came on, cries of disaster echoed from within, coming from his highness. It turned out that the demons weren't just spreading rumors, as an oracle had appeared in the Empire's temple. The Estragon Empire's temple was considered the best in the world, holding significant influence, as it was once the dwelling place of a god. This was the sacred ground where the gods protected the world before leaving it. But now Estragon and Orton were mere shadows of their former selves, like a crumbling collective. Like Damian, Asterisk didn't believe in such absurdities, but the problem wasn't the revelation itself, but what it revealed. It was said that the gods themselves declared a saintess would appear in this world, which initially completely shocked the hero. This news came from the devil's underlings, so calling it an oracle wasn't even funny, as this could lead to chaos. The temple would remain silent until the saintess was found. At this point, Damian realized he should stay away from Estragon for a while. Asterisk decided to check on Orton's situation, only to find that the dark mages were all hiding. It seemed he needed to contact Sonnet. Orton seemed to think she was the only candidate for saintess. The conversation ended there, and the hero hurriedly left the place. Damian knew he needed Laria's help to get close to Princess Sonnet, but he couldn't even understand why he was so angry, perhaps because of the heroine's unfounded guilt. But besides that, having Lara by his side made the hero happy, which was contradictory. Damian felt like he had seen the girl in a dream or a fantasy. Come to think of it, she knew information about him that the hero had never mentioned anywhere. It seemed like a premonition. However, if Lara saw the hero only through fantasy, Damian was the complete opposite. He saw the world as a play in a black and white theater, where people were actors speaking and acting according to a script. Even if someone spoke to him or looked him in the eyes, the hero saw it as an illusion that could disappear at any moment. In this vast world, life was merely interwoven between actors, and Damian always watched from the sidelines, alone. But in all these illusions, Laria appeared, and she felt like a real person, not just a character playing a role in a play. Thanks to her, the world that our hero knew only through weapons began to come alive, connecting with him. All this time, Damian, as a slave, had never been acknowledged as a person anywhere. He just fought, not knowing where justice and immorality lay, who was a friend and who was an enemy. After mastering combat for the sake of food and sleep, he began to obey the commands of others. They used the hero as a shield, throwing him into dangerous battlefields. There, he noticed a spear flying towards a warrior, while an enemy was approaching. At that moment, Damian protected the soldier by blocking the spear with his own shield, and then quickly struck, knocking down the attacker with his sword. The person he saved later became the only one who treated Damian as a friend, acknowledging him as an equal. This person was Asterisk Alan Estragon, the heir to the vast empire that ruled half the continent. His Highness's loyal subjects were displeased with a warrior of slave origin getting close to the crown prince. When political movements began to threaten the hero's life, Asterisk decided to protect him in the name of an order. The prince was even prepared for the possibility that Damian might not return, but he hoped the hero would find a love he could spend his life with. But Damian firmly believed that this would never happen, and that he would certainly die on a battlefield. Then the prince curiously asked if his friend knew why he was still alive. It wasn't just because of Damian's extraordinary strength, but also because he hadn't met his true love yet. Arriving at Isadora's mansion, the hero approached Connie, who was tending the flower garden. At that moment, the maid glanced at him with annoyance, wondering if this was really Damian, who had disappeared for several days. But the only thing our hero cared about now was where Laria was. Meanwhile, Prince Sidar appeared at Lady Duan's banquet, shocking everyone. Eunice immediately decided to invite him in, but His Highness didn't want to cause any inconvenience. Learning that he had come because he was worried about his sister, many noble women were touched by his noble character. According to Laria, the atmosphere had been perfect until he walked in and ruined everything. Sonnet decided to leave immediately, thinking her brother was a difficult person who had coldly rejected her offer. The heroine realized that the prince had casually rejected his sister's invitation, yet pretended to care about his sibling in front of the nobles. Seeing that he was still as pathetic as in her past life, Laria decided she could easily confront him alone. The princess, thrilled with the event, thanked the girl for her company. Patting Sonnet's back, the heroine resolved to take good care of her. Side approached them, cheerfully greeting Isadora's daughter and thanking her for taking care of his sister. Laria coldly replied that there was no need for thanks, and the prince wondered if her male attire had made her voice sterner, but it turned out the real reason for her tone was that she was only kind to those she liked. Remembering her family's tragedy, the prince decided to offer support in case Laria wanted to share her pain with someone close. Realizing he was just trying to get close to Isadora, she firmly but politely refused, wishing him a safe journey. His Highness, stunned by her response, hurriedly left with his sister after bidding the lady farewell. Standing at the doorway, he took one last look back, hoping he and Laria would meet again. Seeing the prince's expression and the heroine's gaze, Jimena couldn't understand why Laria hated His Highness so much. Just then, Eunice appeared, embracing her friends, because what was the point of talking about people you hated at a time like this? The princess's departure marked the beginning of the adult banquet, and the joyful Lady Duan elegantly opened a bottle of champagne. After several hours of drinking and dancing, Jimena was surprised to find Laria still sober. She invited the heroine to dance, and just as Laria agreed, a figure suddenly appeared. It turned out to be Damian, who decided it was his turn, but instead of dancing, he took Laria outside. This left her confused. He wasn't looking at her, and she assumed it was because Damian was still angry, but he denied it. Although upset, Damian couldn't stay mad, so he didn't want to look at Laria. Then she apologized, realizing she hadn't considered his position and had only poured out her own feelings, which he might have taken as delusional. Even so, the royal sword was specifically given to him by the princess, and it would have been better if he hadn't refused it. Moreover, it also involved her mother's money, and since Damian was her bodyguard, he should have accepted it as part of his duty. However, the hero still refused to look at Laria, and she couldn't understand why he was acting like this. Suddenly, she stood in front of him, looking into Damian's eyes, and for the first time, the girl saw such an expression in them. The hero turned his head away, deciding that if Laria didn't avert her gaze, she might regret it. The reason being that Damian might kiss her, which completely caught her off guard. He hoped Laria finally understood his feelings, but she objected to this, grabbing his collar, determined not to shy away from Damian. He decided he would definitely go crazy because of her, and the hero moved closer to Laria, making her extremely flustered. Afterward, as he promised, he gently kissed her lips. When her breathing became unsteady, the heroine decided to stop, but Damian thought it shouldn't be this way. After all, he had warned her beforehand, and there was no need to regret what happened. Suddenly, they heard a young girl scream, who had accidentally seen them. The young lady immediately apologized to them, as she had assumed no one was around and had been walking there. Afterward, Laria suggested they go home, and Damian happily agreed. After escorting the heroine to the manor, he carefully helped her dismount. Laria wondered what Damian thought about their conversation regarding the royal sword and her mother's money. Damian decided he would only act according to his mistress's wishes, which pleased the heroine. Afterward, Laria lay in bed, recalling everything that had happened these days, and her last encounter with the hero. In her past life, Prince Sidar's kiss was like a symbol of love, and now the heroine realized how foolish she had been to think that His Highness's love was real back then. On the other hand, there was no logic, fear, or guilt in Damian's eyes. It was just an action, an impulse to seize a reckless, sudden feeling, which led to their kiss. The hero himself admitted that he kissed Laria simply because he couldn't control himself. Suddenly, Connie rushed to the heroine with a letter from Princess on it. It turned out that Her Highness invited her over when she was free. Looking out the window, the heroine realized the typhoon was coming and decided to close the windows. Remembering that Valentine was going to see a doctor to check his leg, the maid decided to send him an umbrella. She treated him like a mother caring for her child, which made Laria a little uncomfortable. Because even though Valentine seemed like a fool now, he would later become a money-obsessed alchemist. However, Connie thought it was normal for friends to care for each other like this, while her master was too cold to him. Suddenly, the maid felt that Princess Sonnet was like an angel. This thought was triggered by the words of the maid Eunice, who felt that Her Highness was very sweet and kind, just like an angel. The maid also thought that Laria was a demon who stole the young princess's first love, and the hero, Sida, was there to rescue her. Finding Connie's story amusing, Laria decided they would go to the princess's palace together. A few days later, torrential rain caused the river water level to rise dramatically. The storm was so fierce that it felt like the end of the world was coming. One evening, the princess was hiding under a blanket, reading Laria's letter, which said she would visit on a warm autumn day. Suddenly, someone screamed and pulled her blanket away, but Sonnet jumped onto the floor in time. Thinking she was being attacked, she immediately hid in a secret passage under the floor. That night, Her Highness was attacked again by the dark mage. The maids, dressed in robes similar to the princess's, ran in different directions to confuse the attacker. Meanwhile, the guards were fighting the dark mage. They risked their lives. This time, the mage took the lives of 7 guards, 38 soldiers for maids, and 6 servants before taking his own life. Afterward, similar incidents began to occur, with the dark mage attacking women who resembled the saintess, and only 2 survived. One was a nobleman's daughter, the other a landowner's wife. Along with the princess, no one knew who the true saintess was. The nobleman immediately began publicizing his daughter as the saintess, claiming she had displayed extraordinary abilities since childhood. The landowner wasn't backing down either, asserting that his wife was the true saintess, especially since their fields were the only ones unharmed after the typhoon. The kingdom worried about the true saintess's identity, while the temple remained silent for days. According to Laria, the reason was that the temple didn't know the answer either, as the gods had long since abandoned them. During this time, the candidates all pretended to be the saintess. Watching all this, Laria remembered her past life and felt ashamed. She wondered which of these girls her mother thought was most suitable to be the saintess. It turned out Isadora believed they were all fakes. The reason being the god's silence. If the true saintess appeared, there would undoubtedly be a miracle to prove her identity, such as resurrecting the dead, foreseeing the future, or wielding lost divine powers. At that moment, Laria didn't understand why she felt so guilty. Laria believed that if she were truly the saintess, she must have been the saintess in her past life as well, but she hadn't felt anything then. According to Isadora, if the princess were the saintess, the king's power would surpass the church's influence. The temple would, then demand Soden, and if refused, would wage war against the royal family, which was precisely what the prince wanted to exploit. Laria hoped Side wouldn't manipulate the princess like a puppet, molding her into the saintess. However, her mother wasn't worried about this scheme, as she trusted the princess's wisdom. After all, there was a reason the king wanted her to inherit the throne. Then Laria wondered how her mother would react if she herself were the true saintess. Initially, Isadora was tense, but relaxed when she realized it was just a question, not a wish, as it was best not to get involved in such matters. People were celebrating now. It seemed the saintess would have immense power and prestige, but give it some time, and everyone would see the truth. It was impossible to satisfy everyone's demands, because doing something for one person would lead to another wanting the same. Even saving someone's life could result in being cursed by the whole world. Moreover, between the royal family and the church, the saintess would inevitably be caught in political turmoil, placed in the midst of dangerous dealings. God was omnipresent. He only needed to cast his gaze from above. But the saintess was human, and for her, such a life would be painful, full of torment. Laria knew all too well how easy it was to lose oneself while living for others. Her mother thought she was worried about the princess, but in reality, Laria was thinking about herself. A few days later, public opinion began to favor the landowner's wife. No matter how hard the nobleman tried to promote his daughter, no one could deny the story of the field that survived the typhoon. Furthermore, evidence surfaced of the nobleman's daughter's arrogance and debauchery, causing strong public resentment. Even Eunice had often witnessed her less-than-holy behavior at parties. Watching these developments, Laria thought the gods were more benevolent than she'd imagined. As she stood amongst the crowd with Eunice and Jimena, a cloaked figure accidentally bumped into her. It turned out to be Damian, who was confused about what she was doing there. She was simply there to enjoy time with her friends, while the hero was following the crown prince's orders to monitor the situation. Suddenly, Lady Devon and Lady Sweeby remembered urgent matters and hurried off, leaving the pair alone. Observing the young lady, who seemed to have plenty of time, Damian suggested they go on a date. Laria thought Asterisk might scold him for it, but the hero was nonchalant. He led Laria to a large tree where they could enjoy a breathtaking sunset view in peace and quiet. Laria wondered if Damian would directly take the true saintess to the Empire when she was revealed. It was an order, and even if the saintess refused, the hero had to find a way to persuade her. Laria knew he had persuaded her before, but she might still object. Damian looked thoughtfully at Laria and decided to worry about it later. But regardless, if Laria was unwilling, he wouldn't leave, even if it meant disobeying the crown prince's orders. At that moment, Laria thought that since the hero had saved the prince's life in the war, they must be close. She decided to ask why the imperial crown prince needed saintess. Laria was shocked to hear that the saintess would become his strength against the demons. Caries was preparing for the confrontation and gathering forces, but the Orton kingdom was excluded due to its weakness. If a few dark wizards could turn the kingdom upside down, the consequences of a real demon were unimaginable. The kingdom would be defenseless. It turned out the crown prince wanted to claim the saintess and abandon everyone else. Laria knew that if demons occupied the continent, they would turn it into a pasture, and humans would be nothing more than livestock. Before her death, she had witnessed a demon appear in Orton and reduce half of the southern lands to ashes in a single day. Although Damian knew Asterisk didn't expect his loyalty, he still complied with his request, as there was plenty of time and no one would execute a hero for disobedience. But Laria was against the hero disobeying the prince's orders. Then the young woman remembered the people Damian had met during the war, who followed him as if he were their king. The hero was surprised she even knew about this, and at that moment, Laria suddenly came to her senses. She realized she shouldn't have brought it up, as it was Damian's least favorite topic. She wasn't offended by his disbelief because, if it were her, she would also think it was all nonsense. Besides, she didn't want the hero to disobey orders just because it didn't concern her. Damian wanted to delve deeper, but Laria thought it wasn't important, even though the hero disagreed. At that moment, the young woman felt something strange, recalling a similar conversation from her past life. It was after a victory, and Damian had decided to visit the saintess. However, back then, As a princess, Laria couldn't do anything without the prince's permission. Tired of the stuffy air in the temple, she went out onto the terrace to breathe some fresh air when someone called her name. Damian was sitting on the railing, cheerfully greeting Laria. The young woman turned away, thinking it was wrong to address the saintess so casually, but the hero felt that God wouldn't be so petty. He just wanted to know if the saintess really intended to stay in Orton, extending his hand and inviting her to leave with him immediately. But the proud saintess and future wife of the prince didn't want to leave the kingdom at all, so Damian decided to find out if she truly believed that. He received an affirmative answer, but deep down, she thought the truth wasn't that important. She was about to say that her decision was the truth, but somehow she felt like she was lying. For Damian, nothing was more important than the truth, and now, standing before him, she realized he always made her say things she didn't want to say. Laria was embarrassed by her excessive emotionality, but she had endured it for 10 years back then, and now, Damian's emphasis on honesty, yet disbelief in her words, created a conflict within her. Damian eagerly grabbed her hand, apologizing for getting angry at her words, but she was sure that he had nothing in common with the hero she knew. Damian knew the dream might feel real, and that Laria loved that man in the dream, but it had nothing to do with him. The saintess was confused because she was sure what she felt was guilt. She wanted to confess, but after hearing her words, Damian became furious. The hero kept repeating that even if the man in the dream had a similar face and name, they couldn't be the same person. The current Damian didn't have the time and emotions the young woman shared with that man. They were completely different, and her reasons for falling in love with that man had nothing to do with him. Besides, she had nothing to be blamed for now, because he hadn't sacrificed anything for her yet. But Laria still thought it was impossible, because she did love the prince back then, even though she was ashamed of it now. Then Damian asked her to imagine him as the hero from her dream and say everything she wanted to tell him. Laria knew that asking for forgiveness would be enough, but somehow she felt like she was lying again. This time, before discovering Sida's true nature, she had longed for him, but her pure love had slowly faded away. She had left everyone who loved her just because she wanted to be with the prince, but did she still love him now? Now Laria couldn't understand what her actions so far meant, or how she should continue to live. She remembered Damian promising, even in her past life, that as long as Laria didn't hate him, he would always be by her side. Why did he, who was stronger and freer than anyone else, care so sincerely for the prince's puppet? Looking at the saintess, Damian concluded that she had fallen in love with someone who resembled him. Knowing it was impossible, the hero hoped Laria could forget the dream. At first, he thought it was a nightmare tormenting her and that he needed to bring her back to reality. But now he realized how serious everything was. Because the reason Laria sought him out and kissed him was actually for the hero in her dream. Holding the saintess tightly, Damian's greatest wish at this moment was for her to stop crying. When she cried, Damian felt like even owning the whole world wouldn't help him know what to do. Later, while wiping away her tears, Damian wanted to understand Laria's feelings about unrequited love, but she wasn't in the mood for jokes right now. Damian was sure that if she returned to her past life, the hero there would definitely fall in love with her, but she expressed doubt about that. Suddenly, the heroine decided to confess, and soon Damian would be able to catch not only the demon's followers, but the demon itself. In addition to that, his comrades would choose him as king. The hero was perplexed. There was a land that didn't yet have a name, and when Damian and his team took it over, it would become an impenetrable land. Noticing that speaking out made her feel better, Laria decided to continue. As time went on, Damian would also be called the Demon Hunter, and they were the last barbarians. When he fought in Orton, no demons would appear there, because the hero would kill all the dark wizards. Damian Rhode Drake was a man who fulfilled all the requests of the false saintess. Seeing the surprise in his eyes, Laria admitted that she was also just a fake. Later, Connie brought the lady a dessert made of shaved ice. Seeing her swollen eyes, the maid wondered what had happened, but Laria pretended that everything was fine. Then Connie poured some jam on her dessert, thinking it would be tastier that way. It turned out that the ice shaver was invented by Valentine when he found out that Connie liked cold desserts. Laria realized that taking care of Valentine had just been added to the list of things that couldn't be done without a maid. The heroine knew herself that, although it was a rescue, her actions did frighten the poor fellow. However, Connie was sure that there were still many things that couldn't be done without her lady. Thinking about this, Laria was certain that such a thing didn't exist in her past life. The most important thing was to have an obedient and foolish person by the prince's side, but anyone could replace that girl. But when she returned to the past, everything began to change drastically. At first, Laria thought that some omnipotent being had taken pity on her, giving her a chance to change the past and start a happy life anew. But even after changing some things, she noticed that certain moments remained the same, such as the people being deceived by the false saintess and the appearance of demon worshippers originating from the dark wizards. And Damian remained the same, still promising never to leave Laria. Suddenly, while Connie was embroidering napkins, her finger was pricked and started to bleed. Looking at the flowing blood, she suddenly realized that she had been running away from all of this, but now the time had come. Laria asked the maid to call for a carriage while she treated the wound, so she could quickly go somewhere. Once the carriage was ready, she hurried to the Temple of Honor. Connie arranged for her to assume the identity of another servant so that Laria could hide her identity when she got there. Upon arrival, the girl put on a cloak, intending to meet a deity. It was unclear whether a god or a demon had sent her back to the past, so Laria decided to go to the dwelling of one of them to find out. Thinking about not running away from the truth anymore, our heroine boldly entered the temple grounds. Suddenly, her head began to spin violently, and she started to lose consciousness. When she woke up, she found herself in a painfully familiar room, sitting on the floor, leaning against a large bathtub. What annoyed Laria the most was discovering that she was back in her own room in the Marquee Bailey's mansion. Walking into the hallway, she saw her father and the prince discussing their plans to use her to seize the throne. The heroine felt cold and scared, and there was always a feeling of being watched. Suddenly, she noticed a huge statue of a god standing on one of the balconies. On other objects, you could feel the passage of time, but only this statue seemed alive. Unable to suppress her curiosity, the heroine immediately started climbing up to his balcony. Finally facing him, she somehow directly kissed his stone lips. She was overwhelmed by the feeling that she had become a villain who defiled a god. The heroine sincerely hoped that no one would find out that she had done such a thing, but now this place in the temple was the only place she could stay. As she went downstairs, she remembered the times when she wasn't even allowed to smile or walk. Approaching the door, Laria hoped that the god wouldn't be angry with her for that kiss besides. Just one kiss was unlikely to make her the god's chosen one. Stepping inside, the heroine was determined to find out what the god wanted from her. Suddenly, a voice echoed in her mind, curious if Laria was living her second life without regrets. She wondered if it was the god speaking, but it turned out that the source of this voice was called by many names, including God. Laria was surprised to discover she heard the voice directly in her mind. It wasn't like a man's, woman's, or child's, but an otherworldly voice that could read her thoughts. The god began to wonder if she had any more questions. Trying to remain calm, Laria knew she needed to learn as much as possible about the situation. After learning that he was called by different names in different eras, she decided to ask what she should call him now. However, the god considered all existing names to be nothing more than worthless embellishments. Tired of this convoluted reasoning, Laria decided to ask directly if he had chosen her to be the saintess. Perplexed by the question, the god countered by asking if it wasn't she who had chosen him, since it was Laria who awoke him from his slumber with such a bold kiss. In fact, she was the first saintess to choose a god in this way, even considering all the gods combined. Regretting what she had done, Laria thought there were many more worthy people in the world than her. The girl didn't want to bear the burden of being the saintess and wanted to live the life of an ordinary person. Understanding her desire, did the god offer to return her to her previous life in this situation? Laria considered him cruel, as he surely knew she would never agree to that. Remembering her rebirth, Laria decided to clarify, would she really not die, no matter what injury she sustained? Hearing the answer that only the wounds would disappear, but the pain and death would still exist, Laria couldn't understand why the god couldn't heal. However, he wasn't what she imagined, but a forgotten god. Seeing that he seemed saddened, Laria also wanted to know if she had a destined day of death, but the god didn't know, as this was the first time he had turned back time, allowing Laria to correct her mistakes. He asked Laria to close her eyes as she was curious about the past, so he decided to show her the world that existed after her sudden death. Lara saw herself die in the prince's arms after drinking poison, at which point a demon appeared, confused about where his sacrifice had gone. The enraged demon glared at the prince, deciding to take something from him at least. After that, Sida personally loathed the weakness of humans. Becoming the demon's offspring from that day on, the world definitively went down the path of destruction. Damian saw Laria's death from afar and rushed towards the demon with his sword, trying to reach Laria. He threw his sword directly at the prince, but the demon managed to protect him. Not wanting his follower to die, the demon decided to confront the hero next time. But Damian wasn't going to give up, desperately trying to stop them. Suddenly, he noticed Laria's body off to the side, engulfed in the flames of destruction. Approaching her, the hero pleaded with her to wake up, but Lara didn't respond. Knowing she couldn't hear him anymore, Damian began to beg for her forgiveness for leaving her. At that moment, Lara uttered his name, after which the hero turned around, their faces only inches apart. After this, Orton became a base for the demon's followers and a stronghold of black magic. The demon's followers, who had previously fought in scattered groups, formed a massive army of monsters and dark mages. The path to Estragon became a no-man's land, where the king of sin poured out his soul, having lost his beloved woman, ferociously annihilating his enemies. Suddenly, the demon who had saved the prince last time appeared on the battlefield, and Damian rushed towards him. The demon reached out his palm, grabbed the hero, and squeezed hard, splattering blood everywhere. Just then, Prince Asrus arrived on the battlefield, immediately wanting to understand the situation. At that very moment, Damian swung his sword with lightning speed, severing the demon's fingers and freeing himself. Looking at him intently, the monster thought in horror that this was impossible. In an instant, the hero soared into the air, level with the massive creature's face. He quickly spun, delivering a kick of immense force, slamming the demon into the ground. The soldiers watching were shocked that Damian could defeat the demon alone. But as soon as the hero landed, the warriors immediately began to flee, as his transformation into a demon was the reason for his victory. As a man heartbroken by lost love, he was tainted by the demon's blood, which triggered the transformation. Also on that day, the heir to the empire, Osiris, was killed by a friend turned demon. The entire world was handed over to the demon worshippers, and humanity was raised like livestock. Dark mages used them as experimental subjects and as food for the demons. All the demonic beasts were released and began to use human lands to expand their offspring. Eventually, humanity had no choice but to become livestock or slaves and was soon extinct. This was the complete collapse and destruction of the world triggered by the death of the heroine. Witnessing all of this, Laria's vision blurred, and after returning to the temple, she couldn't understand why the god had shown her these things. She couldn't hold back her tears, thinking the god was implying that the world would be destroyed without her. Damian's bloody tears at the moment of the girl's death were deeply engraved in her mind, and only then did she realize how much he loved her. The heroine should have left with him the moment he invited her, forgetting everything about the demon. Perhaps then, they could have been together forever and the world wouldn't be threatened. Lara realized with horror that in this dying world, reduced to ruins, there were also her mother, Sebastian, Connie, Valentine, Eunice, and Jimena. She wondered how she could prevent the world's destruction, only to find that everything depended on her. However, she didn't consider herself a great person capable of intervening in history and changing it. She never thought she would face such a serious matter, thinking of herself as just an ordinary person. But if she didn't act now, everyone she loved might die. The god heard Laria's words that she was willing to do anything, so he gave her a chance to go back to the past and fix everything. Heroes in difficult times are just ordinary people who want to protect their loved ones. The heroine still had doubts, but the god firmly believed that even one person's choices could change history. The god decided to end the conversation, saying that when Laria found his name, he would answer her remaining questions. She tried to hold him back, but then realized the god had left the place and began to think about everything she had heard. She decided she had to find out the name of this unknown god and then go home. Later, Damian was lying in bed looking at the royal sword when he suddenly heard a knock. After approaching and opening the door, he was surprised to see Lara looking at him with a serious expression. The girl took off her hood and confidently walked into his room, leaving the hero bewildered and speechless. She walked past him and rushed to the sword on the bed, demanding that Damian watch carefully. She grabbed the sword and pressed the blade against her hand. Seeing her cut her hand, the hero immediately rushed towards Laria, not understanding what she was doing, but then he saw the fabric on her arm cut, with drops of blood, but no wound. Damian was shocked to hear that she had been the true saintess all along. The heroine immediately explained that she hadn't meant to deceive him. She had only just found out herself. It turned out that her first suspicion arose when her father kidnapped her, and she learned that she had been beaten, but her wounds had healed. Damian was shocked to hear this. Laria thought perhaps the hero would take her to the Empire now, but Damian decided that if she didn't want to go, he wouldn't take her. And if the girl wanted to keep this secret, he agreed to keep it to himself until death. Assured that the hero still regarded her as his master, the girl decided to share her plan with him. Laria wanted Damian to continue investigating the fake saintess and the dark mage, after which she planned to send him back to the Empire. The next day, while walking in the garden, she still couldn't decide whether to tell her mother everything. Indeed, if something were to suddenly happen, it would be best for Isadora to know. Lost in thought, Laria didn't notice Sebastian approaching, carrying a large suitcase. The secretary wished her good morning, and after returning the greeting, the heroine decided to ask him where he was going. Upon learning that he was going to Estola for work, the girl suddenly expressed a strong desire to go with him. Sitting in the carriage, she remembered that her mother had been very busy lately. Laria wondered if it was fair to burden such a busy woman with the responsibilities of a saintess. Seeing the worry on her face, Sebastian guessed that the heroine was very anxious. She always had this expression when something happened that required an urgent and important decision. Laria was surprised, thinking he could read minds, but it turned out the secretary just knew someone similar to her. The heroine laughed and admitted that she felt uneasy about constantly troubling her mother. But according to Sebastian, Isadora was only disappointed that her daughter was too independent. The madam had been wondering if her daughter was suffering too much from loneliness. The secretary knew that Isadora wanted to pamper her daughter, give her pocket money, and eliminate all her worries. Laria was shocked when she learned this, because her mother was the kingdom's greatest entrepreneur, so her daughter shouldn't be spoiled. Sebastian thought this wasn't quite right, because Isadora wasn't just the kingdom's greatest, but the world's greatest, so he wished the madam could find a more suitable place to work, but she was completely unwilling. The reason was to stay by Laria's side, which left the girl quite bewildered. As Stola had been thinking about her, the secretary hoping our heroine would try being pampered. Upon arrival, he helped Laria down from the carriage and escorted her to her mother's office. As Stola, deep in thought with a teacup in hand, was quite surprised by her daughter's sudden visit. Laria immediately rushed to hug her, while her mother wondered what brought her so early. In response, the girl simply wanted to confirm if she could act like a child. This sudden request surprised the woman, who thought her daughter could have always done so. Laria smiled, hugging her mother, confessing that the god himself had chosen her to be the saintess. For the first few seconds, the woman processed what she had heard, then fear washed over her. The heroine revealed the whole story, after which Estola began frantically digesting it all. The woman believed that if Laria didn't want to, she didn't have to do it, as her mother could help. Deep down, the heroine knew all of this would happen. She had just been ignoring it. While she was finally ready to take action, the girl also decided to keep everything a secret for now, at least until those who wanted to use her as the saintess were gone. Laria wanted to destroy Prince Sidar personally and replace the next heir to the throne with Prince Sidar. As time passed, the prince received another letter, which started to annoy him because there were too many. As he began to open the envelope, he unexpectedly discovered that inside was not a seal, but hidden black magic. Sida was curious about what the saintesses were doing and found them reciting prayers. Furthermore, he found the noble's daughter lacked focus, while the peasant woman was illiterate. The prince, who considered them completely useless, was also dissatisfied that the dark mage wanted to create other fake saintesses. Finding the right woman was difficult. It had to be someone not greedy and easily manipulated to deal with the princess. Moreover, it seemed the real saintess had indeed appeared, but it was definitely not the princess. Sida knew the devil's prophecy. The saintess would be reborn after death, pass God's test, and become the woman who rewrites history. However, strangely, God had remained silent so far. If he didn't even punish the fake saintesses, did they really need to fear him? Frustrated by his own ignorance, the prince decided to find out how the preparations were progressing. He discovered that even with all the resources invested, the funds to build an army were insufficient. Sida thoughtfully stroked his chin, deciding that if money was the problem, he just needed to take it. Suddenly standing up from his desk, he felt confused, as he had never thought he would resort to this woman. Thinking it would be a good idea to seize all of Estola's assets, he immediately ordered his men to investigate everything about her. Later, while having tea with her friends, Laria wanted to ask what to do if a man she disliked kept approaching her. Eunice was about to give advice, but Jimena interrupted, wanting to know if someone new had actually appeared in the heroine's life. It turned out the prince's aide was approaching Estola. Sida himself wanted Laria to be his princess. Banquet invitations began pouring in, and the prince's men started investigating the heroine's surroundings. Laria even considered attending the balls again, but Eunice didn't want her to force herself to do something she didn't want to. Then Jimena suggested ignoring the prince altogether, but the heroine worried that this might lead to imprisonment for offending his highness. However, Mrs. Sweevy knew that the prince appeared quite foolish when angry, which was why he always restrained himself. The girl asked, did Laria know that being ignored could truly anger someone? It might not be a big deal to others, but it could indeed be very irritating to the person involved. The heroine was confused by these words, unsure what she should do. Following Jimena's advice, the girl gathered her friends and decided to explain her plan in detail. When she finished, Eunice thought the plan was quite interesting, but Laria doubted its effectiveness. Deciding to give it a try, a few days later she began the first step, refusing the prince's ball invitation. The second step was to actively socialize with other men in front of his highness. On one occasion, Laria even demonstratively left on Damian's arm right under Sida's nose. The third step was to spread rumors that the prince was courting Estola, which Eunice and Jimena immediately set about doing. As regulars at various events and parties, they quickly spread the news throughout the city. The fourth step was to refuse any invitations and gifts from his highness. So when the royal servants came to Laria with gifts and a ball invitation, she declared they had no reason to be there. This was the first time the servants had heard anyone say no to the prince, and they were all shocked, while the tailors still insisted on making a new dress. However, as Estola's daughter, she was perfectly capable of ordering a dress herself, so she quickly dismissed everyone. In addition to this, Laria pretended that Princess Senate had already invited her to the ball, so she couldn't accept the prince's invitation. She knew that putting the princess above his highness sounded crazy to the servants, but in reality, it worked even better. So, with a serious expression, she turned away from the uninvited guests, leaving them bewildered. All this happened within a few days, and Laria was constantly worried about being kidnapped, but surprisingly, Sida didn't bother her again. Now the rumor would spread that she had rejected the prince, and the prince might object to her existence, a thought that gave her peace of mind. But after a while, one evening, people from the palace came again, this time on behalf of Princess Senate. Having accepted her highness's invitation, Laria went to her palace along with Connie and Damian. The heroine was grateful to the royal servants who escorted them, but it turned out they were only following orders. As the heroes confidently walked towards the palace, they suddenly heard the sound of someone running. It turned out there was an order to allow only the young lady to enter the palace, which left Laria somewhat confused. Damian and Connie were also puzzled, so the girl decided to ask why there was such an order. Hearing that it was because there was a big problem in the palace, Laria suggested her friends leave, but they decided to wait for her outside. Satisfied with their decision, Laria knew the princess couldn't have given such an order, and she needed to find out why. It was all very likely because of Sida, who came out to greet the heroine along with his sister. As Laria hugged Senate in greeting, she learned from her that Sida had appeared unexpectedly. Sitting at the table, the prince was embarrassed for interrupting their conversation, and the heroine mentally decided it was best to have him leave. Sida, knowing that the chefs in Senate's palace were very skilled, hoped the girl would enjoy the dinner. The heroine recalled her conversation with her mother and her thoughts about the prince planning to kill Senate. However, Laria also realized that if the princess suddenly died, many would suspect his highness. But Estola was sure that Senate might die from a dark mage's attack, after which the prince would get away unscathed. Apparently, Sida was also involved in having the princess recognized as a saintess, especially since the country was on the verge of war. Laria was very surprised, wondering if there really would be a conflict between the heirs. In this case, the girl was curious whose side her mother would take. But Estola wasn't going to support either side, as she believed merchants shouldn't get involved in politics. Laria didn't understand how she knew all this. It turned out both the prince and princess were actively reaching out. Each faction was approaching the woman, as war required a lot of money, and she had plenty. The heroine remembered that in her past life, there was no war because she pretended to be a saintess and gathered support for Sida. Estola wondered if her daughter really intended to change the heir to the throne. The girl thought it was the best option, after which the woman fell into thought, eventually giving her answer. Meanwhile, the maid who approached the heroine wondered if the young lady wanted dessert. Realizing she was lost in thought, Laria nodded in agreement. Looking at the girl, to her surprise, she saw Sida's servant asking the princess the same question. This maid had looked after the heroine in her past life and was now apparently looking after Senate. The princess decided to have dessert with Laria in her room, as her brother was busy. The girl readily agreed, after which the prince suddenly slammed his fist on the table, deciding that other matters could wait. He wanted to talk to the heroine, hoping she could spare a minute. Laria knew he asked this on purpose, as she couldn't refuse in front of the princess, so she agreed. A worried Senate hoped the conversation wouldn't be too long. From her expression, the heroine realized the princess was afraid of what might happen. The girl confessed that her maid was very fond of Senate, had baked her some cookies and written a letter, and she could bring them over. Now the princess decided that if she said so, she should wait, preoccupied with looking at the cookies and the letter. Laria and Sida left the table, and finally alone, the prince decided to take a walk with her. He then extended his hand to her, hoping to accompany her in the garden. But she coldly turned away, ignoring his gesture, deciding they should hurry. Sida was amazed by Laria, thinking she was truly a remarkable woman. But the heroine was thinking about the more captivating prince who kept looking for her. Suddenly, Sida remembered the recent rumors that she was Bailey's lottery ticket, which truly surprised the girl. There is also a rumor that the person Laria chose would inherit the entire Estola fortune. After listening carefully, the heroine thought that her mother was not at all what people said. However, the prince knew that the lady had donated a large sum of money under Senate's name. Estola used this money to embellish the princess's image, investing it in orphanages, hospitals, and slums. Now, many people considered Senate an angelic princess, the only one who truly cared for the poor and the sick. Sida didn't know about Bailey's lottery ticket, but Estola's seemed to be a sure thing. The heroine thought it was none of her business where her mother spent her money, but the prince was worried that their precious money was being used for political purposes. Laria realized he was treating her like a silly girl who knew nothing again. Sida also heard that Estola had so much money that she could even change the heir to the throne. According to the heroine, even if people became rich, they had no intention of sharing. Therefore, Estola's daughter wasn't planning to share her wealth with her future husband. The prince was very surprised, thinking, does Laria really not know that her mother is supporting Senate? Convinced that she was a foolish woman after all, he immediately perked up. Sida gave off the feeling that he didn't think he was special and didn't believe the rumors about the lady, having heard that he considered her a confident and wise woman. The heroine was disgusted by such lies. The prince reached out his hand, wanting to become her close friend, ready to help at any time. In response, Laria asked him to take his hand away, as she had no intention of accepting the hand of a man who only approached her for money. Hoping the princess hadn't waited too long, the girl decisively went back, leaving Sida dumbfounded. The prince stared after her, clenching his fists, unable to understand how this woman dared to speak to him like that. Later, when the princess was alone with Laria, she ordered all the servants to leave immediately. The maids reluctantly obeyed, and the heroine was curious about what Senate wanted to tell her. It turned out that the princess had seen her brother's expression when he returned from his walk and wanted Laria to be careful. Sida seemed friendly on the surface, but he was a very dangerous person. The heroine carefully looked at the princess and decided to ask her a question, knowing it might be a sensitive topic. She wanted to know if Senate intended to become the next ruler of the Orden Kingdom. It was important to hear this from the princess herself, as there were others who coveted the throne she so reluctantly desired. Senate was surprised by the question, thinking the prince had asked through Laria, but that wasn't the case. Despite her strong dislike for him, the heroine had rejected his highness's proposal, so if she were arrested for offending the royal family, the princess would have to save the lady. Senate was shocked to see, for the first time, someone reject her brother's goodwill and genuinely care about her opinion. She wondered if she could still be happy if she gave up the throne, if she could still receive the same love from her parents and teachers. What the princess wanted most was to live with the person she loved, not to run away, and she was even prepared to confront her brother for this. Senate was ready to become queen and bear the responsibility. Every day, she heard from her teachers about the need to win the support of Estola's daughter. Senate also realized the benefits of having Estola on her side. However, saying such things would make her no different from her brother, which was why the princess had never brought it up. Lara noticed again that although Senate was only 14, she was already very clever. So the heroine decided she would always be on the princess's side. Hugging the princess tightly, Laria's goal was to make her the next ruler of the country. Meanwhile, Sida arrived at the temple of the fake saintesses, who bowed face down to greet him. The prince thought that if he couldn't recruit Estola's daughter, he just needed to find another way. Sida sneered at his puppets, certain that he would be the one to triumph in the end. At night, while Lara was having dinner and watching the news, she realized all the puppets were on the prince's side and decided to ask Damian what he had discovered. The nobleman's daughter only thought about seducing Sida and marrying him, spending every night with the priests. As for the farmer's wife, she stole bribes from the temple and gave them to her husband. Furthermore, she realized she couldn't maintain her saintly facade for long and planned to pack her bags and flee after the banquet. There were also mercenaries disguised as priests in the temple, spies posing as workers, and maids trained as assassins. Our hero still hasn't figured out the evidence in the Black Wizard's temple, but it seems Prince Sida plans to use these Black Wizards to attack the Saintess's welcoming banquet. Lara choked on a meatball, shocked, thinking Sida must be crazy to attack a royal banquet. But according to Damian, it's the perfect opportunity for him to put Princess Senate forward as a candidate for the throne and then kill her. The Black Wizards are preparing a large-scale attack, and it's unknown if the Guardian Knights can stop them. The hero turned to Lara, curiously asking with a smile what the Saintess plans to do now. However, Lara didn't like him calling her that, and she didn't know what to do either, not even wanting to ask the god. The reason being that the god was a terrible conversationalist, only spouting nonsense before quickly disappearing and demanding they find his name. Damian sneered, recalling stories from the battlefield, believing gods have always been like this, only watching when people need them, but appearing when they need humans, throwing down a task and quickly vanishing. He looked thoughtfully out the window. Lara hoped that if the demons discovered she was the Saintess and started hunting her, the hero wouldn't seek revenge. Damian was shocked by this, but Lara felt it was best not to take him too seriously. She said this because demons were always hunting Saintesses, and she just wanted him to live happily, even if it meant her death. Looking at the hero's dignified face, she started lifting the corners of his mouth with her fingers, hoping to see him smile. Damian shouldn't be angry, but rather become a little selfish, because there must be something he deeply desires to achieve. The hero couldn't help but think she was foolish, because if he wanted anything, she could easily make it happen. Besides, even if Lara angered the god, she would always be the Saintess, and if the demons needed a Saintess, Damian decided to be their opponent, never leaving Lara no matter what. Because he believed it was his responsibility to fight for her and protect her, even though that wasn't Laria's intention at all. The hero became curious, asking her if she knew what would happen if someone who never wanted anything suddenly desired something. Receiving no response, Damian revealed the secret. Such a person would go mad. Completely bewildered, the girl decided to ask directly. What exactly did he want? After a short pause, the hero decided he wanted a lady, or more precisely, a foolish girl. Time passed, and the day of the welcoming banquet for the Saintesses arrived. The candidates, with radiant faces, descended before the guests amidst applause. Lara wondered if they knew that the prince who made them Saintesses planned to kill them today. Because Damian knew this would happen, Laria had made ample preparations. She told her mother, Estola, and Princess Senate, and they secretly gathered their forces in their respective positions. This banquet would be the perfect opportunity to catch the monstrous prince and obtain solid evidence. To do this, the black wizards had to be stopped, and the only one who could do that was Damian. Since only knights could carry weapons at the banquet, Senate had the hero pose as her guard. Laria knew that, unlike him, she couldn't stop the assassins with force, but she had her vast knowledge to rely on. At this moment, the prince's maid approached the princess, hoping she would allow her brother to socialize with the Sanuses. Laria was truly grateful she remembered this maid's face from her past life. Just knowing who was involved in the prince's plan increased the possibility of preventing disaster. Seeing the maid and Senate approach, Sida immediately left the Sanuses, wanting to leave them alone with his sister so he could deal with them all at once. Realizing this, Laria followed them, thinking about how to stop the maid. Just then, one of the Sanuses began openly mocking Eunice and Jimena, comparing them to dogs. While she was verbally attacking the girls, she didn't notice Laria approach and suddenly grab her hair. The saintess was immediately frightened, thinking the gods probably hadn't taught this scoundrel any manners. At that moment, Laria slammed the saintess's head against the table with all her might, shocking everyone. Laria thought if she was a saintess, then the gods would surely save her. She wanted to see this miracle. Then she looked at the completely bewildered Damian, and Laria immediately screamed at the table, further confusing the guests. In that instant, the hero spun around and charged towards the guests like lightning. Suddenly, one of the tables where the princess and the saintesses were meant to gather began emitting black smoke. Immediately following was a massive explosion that shook the entire building. Damian, having just arrived, shielded Laria and the others from the flying debris. He quickly scanned his surroundings and spotted a figure in a black cloak on the balcony. Moments later, Damian arrived there as well, deciding to see if the black wizard was in a hurry to go somewhere. Startled by the knight's sudden appearance, the wizard turned and fled, hiding in a room to set up an ambush. When Damian followed him inside, the enemy shot a dark magic arrow at him. Though unsure why the hero had come, the wizard panicked completely when he saw Damian calmly catch the arrow with his hand. The hero decided it was time to end this before he suffered any significant pain. Meanwhile, Laria noticed the princess's maid wandering the hall, searching for Senate with her hand hidden behind her back. The girl realized that since the explosion had failed, they would definitely try to kill Senate another way. The maid finally found the princess and, pulling the hidden dagger from behind her back, intended to finish the girl off. But the protagonist unexpectedly stepped between them, shielding the princess with her body. At that moment, as she lost consciousness, she saw the knights rush in and restrain the maid. Suddenly, Estola appeared, tears streaming down her face, pushing past all the guards and running to her daughter. The princess did the same, but the protagonist could no longer hear anyone's voices. The woman immediately called for a doctor, but Laria suddenly woke up, stating that she was completely fine. Senate wanted to take her to a doctor immediately, but the protagonist flatly refused. Leaving the castle under these circumstances would be difficult, so Laria decided to go with her mother to the princess's room. Meanwhile, the king and queen returned to the banquet hall after a short absence, looking rather bewildered. Sida appeared, firmly believing that this was undoubtedly the work of black wizards. The prince wanted to express his concern and desire to eradicate all evil, but the king was only concerned about his daughter's whereabouts. Seeing her safe and sound, the monarch was relieved, right in front of the shocked prince, who hadn't expected to see her. The king immediately ordered that no one leave the castle until the culprit was found. Suddenly, Damian appeared, throwing the black wizard to the dumbfounded knights. As the soldiers recovered from their shock, the king became curious about the situation. Upon learning that they had captured a black wizard, the monarch was stunned, and Sida became extremely nervous. However, the knights couldn't find the person who had delivered the captured enemy. Although the culprit who caused the harm was caught, there was naturally a mastermind behind it all. The mercenary disguised as a priest and the spy posing as a worker were also arrested. However, no one could confirm that Prince Sidar was the mastermind behind all this. Senate wished at least one person would come forward, and Laria was curious about the prince's behavior during this chaos. It turned out he was furious about what had happened, and the false saintesses were taken to the temple. Even with increased protection for the saintesses, Sida would undoubtedly look for another opportunity to kill them. Therefore, the protagonist wanted to see them before he did, but according to the princess, she needed treatment first. Just then, a servant's voice came from outside the door, sent to escort Senate to the king. On the way, the princess decided to prepare a room for Lara to use during her recovery and call for a doctor. Knowing there was no other way, the protagonist revealed her secret, that she wasn't actually injured at all. Senate was shocked when she saw that there wasn't even a trace of blood where the supposed wound was. Thus, Lara didn't want to cause trouble by calling a doctor and hoped the princess would hurry to see the king. The utterly bewildered princess ran off, determined to have the protagonist explain everything in detail upon her return. Left alone, Estola, though aware of her healing abilities, was still quite surprised. After all, even if Lara possessed divine powers, it didn't make it any easier to accept that her daughter had been stabbed. The woman wondered if the protagonist was going to confess her saintess identity to Senate now, but she was still considering it. Later, Lara and Damian discovered the bodies of the farmer's saintess wife and her husband in the night garden near the palace. They had staged the scene to look like a robbery, stealing the jewels and fleeing. Deciding not to waste any time, the heroes immediately headed to the second saintess, who was still alive. Startled by their arrival, the nobleman's daughter was about to scream, but Lara quickly calmed her down. Hearing that Estola was protecting her parents from the prince, the girl initially didn't believe it, not understanding what the protagonist wanted from her. Lara wanted her to confess to the king, but the girl knew this could lead her to the gallows. However, the female lead assured her of her safety and even offered to help her relocate to another country. But the girl still refused to confess, preoccupied with her own safety. This made Lara very angry. The girl had to deal with that bastard Sida quickly, or he would kill her. Finally, the next day, all of the prince's crimes were exposed. After the fake saintess confessed, others who had noticed the situation began to reveal more of the prince's evil deeds. The indecisive monarch could hardly believe that his own son had tried to kill his sister, but the evidence was irrefutable. Enraged by his son's betrayal, the king marched to his palace with his knights. However, no matter how they shouted, Sida refused to come out, so the king ordered his soldiers to take action. They decided to smoke the prince out with fire and ordered the death of anyone who tried to protect him. Watching from the window, Lara remembered how Sida had built a pyre and burned her alive in her past life. That time, the female lead had been forced to take poison and died in agony. Now it was his turn, and she only needed to watch it all unfold calmly.